Hello everyone, I am the Midnight Storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Turn back now if you still believe the person calling you is always human. I used to believe that too. I don't anymore. And by the time I tell you why, you might stop believing it either. My name's Derek Holloway. I'm 35. I work remote in software development for a company based out of Denver. And I live alone in a rental house on the outskirts of the city quiet street. Decent neighbors. Nothing that ever gave me reason to think much about my own safety. I tell you all this because I want you to understand I'm not the type who spooks easily. I've worked night shifts on deployment calls for years. I've sat alone in empty office buildings at 3 in the morning debugging server crashes. I don't scare easy. That changed on a Tuesday night in November. At exactly 1:17 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was still awake. Working late on a release that was already behind schedule. Laptop glowing in the dark of my living room. Coffee gone cold beside me. My phone was sitting face up on the couch cushion next to me, and when it started ringing, I glanced over out of pure reflex, the way you do when any phone rings near you. The screen showed my own number, not unknown caller, not no caller ID. My actual phone number, the same 10 digits printed on my business cards, displayed on my own lock screen like I was somehow calling myself. I stared at it for a second, genuinely confused rather than afraid. My first thought was some kind of spoofing scam. The sort of thing where robocallers fake a number to make you more likely to pick up. I'd read about that happening. I let it ring out without answering, watched the screen go dark again, and went back to my laptop. Already halfway convinced I'd think about it again in the morning and laugh at how strange it had briefly seemed. A minute later, it rang again. Same number, my number, displayed clean and unmistakable across the screen. Glowing in the dark room, I picked it up this time, more out of irritation than curiosity. Ready to say something sharp to whatever scam operation had gotten hold of caller ID spoofing software good enough to mimic my exact digits. I didn't get the chance to say anything at all. What came through the speaker first wasn't a voice. It was breathing. Slow, steady, deliberate breathing, close into the microphone on the other end. The kind of sound that made the hair on my arm stand up before my mind had even caught up to what I was hearing. I sat frozen on my couch, phone pressed to my ear, listening to someone or something breathe on the other end of a call that was, according to every piece of information my phone was giving me, coming from my own number. Then a voice, quiet, flat, almost gentle, in a way that somehow made it worse. "Don't open the bedroom door." The line went dead before I could say a single word back. I sat there in the dark living room for a long moment, phone still pressed against my ear, listening to nothing but the dial tone. My heart hammering hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. My bedroom door was closed, same as it always was at night. Nothing about it had ever seemed like something I needed to be warned about, until that exact moment, when it suddenly felt like the most dangerous door in the entire house. I did what I think most people would do in that first frozen moment of fear. I reached for my phone's home security app, the one connected to the 3 cameras I'd installed around the house the year before, mostly for package theft, never once imagining I'd need them for anything like this. The app wouldn't load. I sat there tapping at the screen, watching the little loading wheel spin uselessly against a blank gray box where the live camera feeds should have been. I tried closing and reopening it, same result. I tried switching to Wi-Fi instead of cellular data, thinking maybe it was a connection issue on my phone's end. Nothing changed. Every single camera in my house showed the exact same error message, unable to connect. Check your device's power and network status. All 3 cameras, at once. In a house where I'd never once had all 3 drop connections simultaneously in the entire year I'd owned the system, I sat very still on my couch, laptop forgotten beside me, listening to the ordinary sounds of my house at night. The refrigerator humming in the kitchen. The faint tick of the baseboard heater. Sounds I'd never once paid attention to before that now seemed to carry a weight they'd never had. My bedroom door, down the short hallway off the living room. Stayed exactly as it always was. Closed. Ordinary. Except now I couldn't stop staring at it. I thought, briefly, about calling the police. But calling and telling them what? Exactly, that I'd gotten a strange call from a spoofed version of my own number, telling me not to open my bedroom door, and that my cameras happened to be malfunctioning at the same time. I could already imagine how that would sound to a dispatcher. How thin and unconvincing it would feel once I actually tried putting it into words. Instead, I did something that, looking back, probably wasn't the smartest decision I've ever made. I grabbed the heaviest thing within reach, an old cast iron skillet still sitting on my stovetop from dinner 2 nights earlier, and I crept toward the hallway. Phone in my other hand. Flashlight app on. Moving slowly toward that closed bedroom door, like I was approaching something that might, at any moment, decide to move on its own. I stood outside it for what felt like a long time, listening. Nothing. No sound from inside. No shifting, no breathing, nothing but the ordinary silence of an empty room. The same silence that had been behind that door every single night I'd lived in this house. I almost convinced myself, standing there, that the whole thing had been some elaborate, cruel prank someone who'd somehow gotten my number, spoofed it back to me, and was now enjoying whatever fear they'd managed to create from wherever they actually were. I almost reached for the door handle right then, ready to prove to myself there was nothing behind it but my bed and my dresser and the ordinary clutter of my ordinary life. That's when I heard it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, coming from the other side of that closed door. Not urgent, not panicked, measured, patient, almost polite. The way you might knock on a door you had every right to be standing behind. I stumbled backward so fast, I nearly dropped the skillet, my back hitting the hallway wall hard enough to knock a framed photo askew. I stood there, frozen, staring at that door, my breath coming in short, ragged pulls, waiting for the knocking to happen again. It didn't. The house went silent once more. That same heavy, waiting silence that somehow felt worse than any sound could have. And then, from the living room behind me, my phone started ringing again. I didn't move for a full 10 seconds. Phone ringing somewhere behind me in the living room, bedroom door still closed and silent in front of me. My whole body caught between 2 directions I didn't want to go in. Eventually, the pull to know to actually understand what was happening, rather than stand frozen in a hallway, waiting for something worse, won out. And I backed away from the bedroom door, slowly, never fully turning my back on it, and made my way to where my phone sat vibrating against the couch cushion. Same number, my own, displayed clean across the screen like it had every time before. I answered it with hands that weren't fully steady anymore. "Who is this?" I said, keeping my voice low, glancing back toward the hallway every few seconds like the bedroom door might do something the moment I looked away from it. There was a pause. That same slow breathing filling the silence before any words came. And then, in that same flat, unnervingly calm voice from before, "You didn't listen. Listen to what's in my bedroom." Another pause, longer this time. "You'll find out eventually. Everyone always does. Is this some kind of joke? Did somebody set this up because it's not funny?" "No joke," the voice said. "Check your closet, the one in the hallway, not the bedroom. 3rd shelf from the top. Then you'll understand." The call ended before I could ask anything else. That same abrupt dead silence, replacing the voice like someone had simply hung up mid-thought. I stood there in my living room for a long moment, staring at my phone, trying to decide whether following instructions from whatever was calling me was the most foolish thing I could possibly do, or whether I genuinely had no better option available to me at that point. My hallway closet was maybe 8 feet from where I stood. A shallow linen closet I mostly used for spare towels and old boxes I hadn't bothered sorting through since I'd moved in 2 years earlier. I approached it slowly, skillet still gripped in one hand, phone's flashlight still on in the other. I opened the door. The 3rd shelf from the top held exactly what it always held: folded towels, a spare set of sheets, An old shoebox of cables I kept meaning to throw away. Nothing unusual. Nothing that explained anything. Except, pushed toward the back, half hidden behind the shoebox, was a phone. An old phone. A model I recognized immediately, because it had been my previous phone. The one I'd upgraded from nearly 8 months earlier. The one I distinctly remembered wiping clean and dropping into an e-waste recycling bin at my local electronics store, the way you're supposed to responsibly dispose of old devices. I hadn't seen that phone in 8 months. I was absolutely certain, standing there staring at it, that I had recycled it exactly the way I remembered. And yet there it was, sitting on my closet shelf, screen dark, seemingly powered off. I reached for it with a shaking hand, and the moment my fingers touched the case, the screen flickered to life on its own. It was ringing. An incoming call, the screen displaying, impossibly, the exact same number as my current phone, my own number. Calling itself. From a device that shouldn't have existed anywhere in my house at all. I dropped the old phone like it had burned me, and it clattered onto the hallway floor. Screen still lit, still ringing. That impossible call continuing, even as it lay there, face up on the hardwood. I backed away from it, skillet raised without any real plan for what I intended to do with it. My mind racing through explanations that all felt equally insane and equally insufficient for what I was actually looking at. My current phone, still in my other hand, started ringing at the exact same moment. 2 phones, both mine, both displaying my own number, both ringing in perfect, impossible unison in my dark hallway at nearly 2 in the morning. I don't fully remember deciding to answer either one. I think my body just moved on its own. Some instinct overriding the part of my brain screaming that this was exactly the moment I should be running for the front door. Instead, I picked up my current phone. The breathing was there again, but different this time, faster, more ragged, less controlled than the calm, measured voice from before. And underneath it, faintly, I could hear something else. Another voice, distant, muffled, like it was coming from somewhere deeper inside the phone itself, or from somewhere else in the house entirely. It was saying my name, over and over. Derek, Derek, Derek. And it sounded, impossibly, unbearably, exactly like my own voice. I stood frozen in that hallway, phone against my ear, listening to something that sounded like me calling my own name from somewhere I couldn't place, while the old phone on the floor continued ringing beside me, screen glowing steady in the dark. That's when the knocking started again. 3 deliberate raps, coming once more from behind my closed bedroom door, exactly as measured and patient as before. I don't know what finally pushed me to move toward that door, instead of toward the front exit, toward my car, toward literally anywhere else, I think. Honestly, it was less courage than a kind of desperate need to end the uncertainty. To know rather than to keep standing frozen in a hallway between 2 ringing phones and a door that wouldn't stop knocking. Whatever this was. Some part of me had decided I needed to face it directly rather than let it keep circling around me in the dark. I crossed the remaining distance to my bedroom door. Skillet raised. Phone still pressed against my ear with that impossible voice still calling my name from somewhere inside it. And I reached for the handle. I turned it. I pushed the door open, and what I found on the other side was not what I expected. Not a person, not an intruder, not anything I could point to and immediately name. The room was empty, completely, ordinarily empty, exactly as it should have been. My bed made the way I always leave it, my dresser undisturbed. The window closed and locked exactly as I remembered leaving it hours earlier before I'd ever sat down to work. But my phone screen, held loosely now in my shaking hand, showed something that made every hair on my body stand on end. The call was still connected, still active, still showing my own number on the other end. And through the speaker, unmistakably, I could hear breathing close, immediate, right beside me, even though the room in front of me was completely, verifiably empty. The breathing wasn't coming from the phone at all. It was coming from directly behind me. In the hallway I'd just walked out of. I spun around so fast, the skillet nearly flew out of my hand. My whole body flooding with an adrenaline so sharp it felt almost like pain. The hallway behind me was empty. Completely. Visibly empty, no shape, no figure. Nothing standing there that could account for the breathing I'd heard so close. So immediate. That it should have been standing right against my back. But the old phone was still there on the floor where I'd dropped it. Screen still lit. And as I stared at it, the display shifted. The call that had been connected, the one on my current phone, the one with the breathing and the distant voice calling my name, ended abruptly. Both screens going dark at exactly the same moment. Like a single switch had been thrown somewhere I couldn't see. I stood there in the sudden silence, chest heaving, skillet still raised, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. The house had gone completely, eerily quiet. The kind of silence that felt less like relief and more like held breath. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my living room couch with every light in the house turned on. Both phones, my current one and the old one, I'd retrieved from the closet with a towel wrapped around my hand. Unwilling to touch it directly again, placed on the coffee table in front of me. Watching them like they might do something else if I let my attention slip even for a moment. Neither phone rang again before sunrise. When morning finally came, gray light filtering through my living room windows, I felt something close to normalcy return. Enough that I could think clearly for the first time in hours. I called a locksmith first. Had every lock in the house changed by mid-morning. Though some part of me already understood that whatever had happened the night before probably hadn't involved anyone coming through a conventional door, I called a cybersecurity consultant next. A guy I'd worked with professionally a few times over the years, and explained as much of the situation as I could without sounding completely unhinged. The spoofed calls, the camera outage, the old phone that shouldn't have existed anywhere in my house. He came by that afternoon, and what he found, after several hours of digging through my home network and both devices, gave me an explanation that was almost more disturbing than the impossible one I'd half expected. "Your old phone's still active," he told me, turning the device over in his gloved hands. "Not on a cell plan, but it's connected to your home Wi-Fi. Looks like it auto-reconnected the moment it came back into range of your router. Probably still had the credentials saved from before you upgraded. Someone's been using an app installed on this thing to spoof your current number and place calls through your Wi-Fi network, probably remotely, without ever needing to be physically present in your house at all." "But I recycled that phone 8 months ago," I said. "I dropped it off myself. I watched them put it in the collection bin." I was quiet for a moment, turning the device over again, studying something on the screen he'd managed to unlock. "According to the activity logs, this phone's been active and connected to your network consistently for the past 6 weeks. Somebody's had access to it that whole time. Either it never actually made it into that recycling bin the way you remember, or somebody retrieved it afterward and found their way back into your house at some point to plant it exactly where you'd eventually find it. Who would even know how to do that? Who would want to?" He didn't have an answer for that part. But he did find one more thing on the device that made the whole situation crystallize into something far more personal, far more frightening than a random hacker or an anonymous prankster ever could have. Buried in the phone's call history, alongside all the spoofed calls from the past 6 weeks, was a single saved contact. Just one name, attached to a phone number I recognized instantly, because I'd deleted it from my own contacts nearly a year earlier. After a friendship that had ended badly enough that I'd wanted every trace of it gone from my life. The name saved in that old phone's contact list was Marcus Webb. I want to explain who Marcus was to me, because the context matters more than almost anything else in this story. We'd been close friends for nearly a decade. All the way back to college, the kind of friendship where you assume you'll be standing up in each other's weddings someday, where you don't think twice about handing over a spare key or sharing passwords for streaming accounts you split the cost of. He'd actually helped me set up my original home network years earlier, back when we both still lived in the same city. Back before a falling out over a business venture we'd tried and failed to build together had ended things between us in a way that still made my stomach turn whenever I thought about it. The short version is that I'd made a call during that failed venture that Marcus believed had cost him a significant amount of money and, more painfully for him, what he'd considered his one real shot at building something of his own. He hadn't been entirely wrong to be angry. I'd made a decision under pressure that hadn't panned out the way either of us hoped. And it had genuinely hurt him financially in ways I still felt guilty about, even a year later. But the way he'd reacted, the escalating anger, the accusations that had gotten increasingly personal and increasingly unfair, had eventually pushed me to cut contact entirely, block his number, delete every trace of him from my phone and social media, and move on with a friendship I'd once valued more than almost any other relationship in my life. I hadn't heard from him in over a year. I genuinely hadn't thought about him with any real frequency in months, had assumed. The way you do with painful endings. That we'd simply become two people who used to know each other and now didn't. Except, apparently, he'd never actually let go the way I had. My cybersecurity friend helped me trace back further into the old phone's activity. And what we found painted a picture that made my skin crawl in an entirely different way than the impossible calls themselves had. Marcus had, it appeared, retrieved my old phone from the recycling facility. Somehow, my friend speculated he might have paid an employee or found some other way to intercept it before it was actually processed and wiped, and had spent months quietly setting up software that allowed him to spoof my number, access my home Wi-Fi network using credentials that, embarrassingly, I genuinely never changed since he'd originally helped me set them years earlier, and used that access to tap into my camera system remotely whenever he chose to. The old phone in my closet wasn't some impossible supernatural object. It was a physical device he needed nearby, connected to my home network, in order to route those spoofed calls and access my cameras without needing sophisticated remote infrastructure of his own. Which meant, more disturbingly than anything else we'd uncovered, that at some point in the past 6 weeks, he'd needed to physically enter my house to plant it there. I gave the police everything we'd found: the phone itself, the activity logs, Marcus's name and his last known address, which my old contacts, thankfully, still had saved somewhere in a backup I hadn't fully deleted. They executed a search warrant within days, and when they searched Marcus's apartment, they found not just the software and hardware setup that matched everything my cybersecurity friend had identified, but something else too: a spare key to my current house, one I'd genuinely never given him, which meant he must have made a copy at some point years earlier. Back when our friendship was still intact, and I'd trusted him enough not to think twice about him having access to my space. The knocking, the breathing, the voice calling my name in something that sounded, impossibly, like my own voice, all of it, according to what investigators eventually pieced together, had been Marcus himself, physically present in my house that night, hiding in a crawlspace accessible from an exterior panel near my bedroom closet that I hadn't even known existed until police pointed it out to me, using a voice modulation app on his own current phone to distort his voice into something that sounded unsettlingly close to my own. He'd been in my house that whole night, close enough to knock on my bedroom door, close enough to breathe directly behind me in that hallway, hidden in a space in my own home I hadn't even known was there. Marcus was arrested within the week, and once confronted with the evidence, the software, the crawlspace access, the spare key he'd never returned, he gave a statement that filled in the last remaining pieces of what had happened, though it did nothing to make any of it feel less disturbing. According to what he told investigators, the plan had never actually been to physically hurt me. He'd spent the past year, in his own words, unable to move past what he saw as a fundamental betrayal on my part. And somewhere in that stew of resentment and financial hardship, the venture's collapse had apparently hit him even harder than I'd realized, costing him not just money, but a relationship of his own that had ended partly because of the strain he'd decided that making me feel genuinely, deeply afraid was a kind of justice he was owed. He'd found my old phone through, of all things, a former connection at the e-waste facility, someone he'd apparently paid to intercept it before it was processed, banking on the fact that most people never think to fully wipe every trace of network credentials before disposing of old devices. From there, he'd spent months quietly studying my home network, learning the crawlspace existed through old blueprints he'd apparently kept from back when he'd helped me set up the house's original security system, and slowly building toward that one elaborate, terrifying night. The voice on the phone hadn't just been a modulation app, making his voice sound vaguely similar to mine. Investigators found, during their search, Hours of recorded audio-video calls we'd had years earlier, back when we were still close friends, that he'd apparently kept and used to train voice cloning software sophisticated enough to reconstruct convincing approximations of my own speech patterns. The line about the bedroom door, the breathing, even that fragmented, distant-sounding call of my own name. All of it had been carefully constructed in advance, rehearsed and refined using pieces of my actual voice that I'd unknowingly handed him years before any of this began. I sat through his sentencing hearing months later, listening to details I still find difficult to fully process even now. Stalking charges, unlawful entry, unauthorized computer access. He received a sentence that included both jail time and a lengthy restraining order, along with mandated psychological treatment that the judge specifically noted as a condition of his eventual release. I don't know, even now, exactly what closure is supposed to feel like after something like that. Part of me still struggles to reconcile the Marcus I'd known for nearly a decade, the friend who'd stood by me through genuinely difficult years, who'd helped me move into that very house, who I'd once trusted enough to hand over the keys to my life without a second thought, with the person capable of spending months constructing something this elaborate, this deliberately designed to make me question my own sanity, my own safety. Inside the one place that was supposed to feel safest, my cybersecurity friend, once everything had settled, helped me completely rebuild my home network from scratch. New credentials for absolutely everything. No lingering trace of anything Marcus might have once had access to. I had that crawl space permanently sealed within days of the police finishing their investigation, unable to stand the thought of an accessible gap existing anywhere near my bedroom that I hadn't even known about until it had already been used against me. I moved, eventually, about 8 months after everything happened. Not because Marcus posed any further direct threat. The restraining order and his sentencing made that unlikely, at least for the foreseeable future, but because I simply couldn't shake the feeling of unease that particular house had left me with. No matter how many locks I changed or networks I rebuilt, I think about that entire ordeal more often than I expected I still would. Even now, more than a year removed from that night. Not just the fear of it, though that certainly lingers in ways I didn't fully anticipate the way I still, in my new apartment, find myself pausing before I open any closed door. The way any unexpected call from an unfamiliar or even oddly familiar number still sends a small jolt of adrenaline through me before I can fully rationalize it away. What I think about most, though, isn't the fear itself. It's the specific, deliberate cruelty of how Marcus chose to express whatever pain and resentment he'd been carrying. He didn't confront me directly. He didn't send an angry message. Didn't show up at my door demanding some kind of accounting for what had happened between us professionally. Instead, he spent months, actual months, careful and patient and technically sophisticated months, building an elaborate machine specifically designed to make me doubt my own perception of reality, to turn my own house, my own voice, my own sense of safety into weapons against me. I've talked about this extensively with a therapist since. Someone who specializes in trauma related specifically to technology-facilitated stalking and harassment. A field I genuinely hadn't known existed as its own specialty until I needed it. She helped me understand something about the whole situation that I think matters beyond just my own specific story, that this particular kind of harm, facilitated through the exact devices and systems we've come to depend on for convenience and connection, presents a growing and still poorly understood category of danger that a lot of people simply aren't prepared to recognize until they're already living inside it. The tools that make our lives easier, she told me during one of our sessions, are the same tools that, in the wrong hands, become almost perfectly designed instruments of control and fear. Most people don't think twice about old passwords, old devices, spare keys handed out years earlier during relationships that have since ended. But those small, seemingly insignificant pieces of access rarely fully disappear on their own. They linger, unless you actively go back and close them off. That advice has genuinely reshaped how I approach my own digital life since. I do regular audits now, every few months, checking exactly which devices and accounts have access to my home network, exactly who might still theoretically hold a key or a password from some earlier chapter of my life that I never got around to formally closing off. It feels excessive some days. A little paranoid, even to me. But I think about that night, about a voice that sounded almost exactly like my own. Calling from a phone I genuinely believe no longer existed, and the excessive caution feels, on balance, like a small price to pay. I also think, more than I expected to, about the friendship itself. Not with any lingering warmth. Not anymore. But with a kind of sad bewilderment I don't think we'll ever fully resolve. Marcus and I had built something real together over nearly a decade. Something I genuinely valued. Before a single failed business decision unraveled into something dark enough to produce what eventually happened. I don't think either of us, back in our 20s, building that friendship over late nights and shared ambitions, could have imagined it, with police search warrants and voice cloning software and a crawl space hidden in the walls of my own house. I don't know what that says about resentment, ultimately, or about how a single grievance, left unaddressed and allowed to fester in isolation for long enough, can eventually metastasize into something almost unrecognizable from whatever legitimate hurt it originally started as. I want to leave you with something more than just the fear this story probably left you sitting with, because I think there's a genuine lesson buried underneath everything that happened to me, one that goes beyond just the specific, unlikely technical details of spoofed calls and hidden crawl spaces. Close your accounts properly when relationships end. Not just romantic ones, friendships, business partnerships. Any relationship where you once handed someone access to your life without a second thought, back before you had any reason to imagine they might someday use that access against you. Change your passwords. Reclaim your spare keys. Audit your old devices before you assume they're simply gone once they leave your hands. I learned all of this the hardest possible way. And I genuinely hope you never have to learn it the same way I did. But I think the deeper lesson, the one I keep circling back to even now, has less to do with technology and more to do with something older and harder to fully guard against. Marcus didn't become capable of what he did overnight. It grew slowly, in isolation. Fed by a grievance he never brought back to me directly. Never gave either of us a chance to actually resolve or understand from the other's perspective. He let it curdle in private, alone with his own resentment, until an entirely disproportionate response felt, to him, like the only remaining option left. I think about how easily that could have gone differently. If he'd called me, even angry, even hurt, even months after everything fell apart, if he'd simply said the things he was feeling directly, instead of channeling them into months of careful, technical, deliberate cruelty. I think there's a version of this story where we're still, at the very least, two people capable of an uncomfortable but honest conversation, rather than one of us facing years of legal consequences and the other left permanently unable to feel fully safe inside his own home. That's the warning I want to leave you with. More than any specific advice about passwords or old devices, whatever grievance you're carrying, whatever hurt you've let sit alone in the dark for too long without ever giving the person who caused it a real chance to hear it, be careful what that isolation eventually grows into. Curiosity about how far you could take a resentment, how elaborate a form your anger could eventually build itself into, is its own kind of danger. One that consumes this person carrying it just as much as whoever it's eventually aimed at. I don't know, even now, whether Marcus ever fully understood what he became by the end of all this, whether the version of himself capable of hiding in my crawl space at 2 a.m, distorting his own voice into an approximation of mine, would recognize himself as the same person who once helped me move boxes into that very house, laughing about nothing in particular. Back when we were still just two friends building lives we thought we understood. I sleep with my phone across the room now, charging on a dresser instead of beside my bed. A small habit I doubt I'll ever fully break. Some nights, when it buzzes with a notification I wasn't expecting, I still feel that same brief jolt of adrenaline before I remember, consciously, deliberately, that the version of danger I once lived through has a name now, a resolution, a sentence being served. But the discomfort itself that particular, hard-won wariness, I don't think that ever fully goes away. I don't know that it should. Some doors, once you've learned what can be waiting behind them, you never quite stop checking twice before you open again. I don't believe in ghosts. I want to say that up front, because by the end of this, you're going to wonder if I do. And the honest answer is I still don't. What happened to me wasn't a ghost. It was something a lot more real. And honestly, a lot more frightening than anything supernatural could have been. My name's Priya Malhotra. I'm 29 years old, and I live alone in a one-bedroom apartment in Seattle, up on Capitol Hill. In one of those older buildings with the narrow hallways and the doors that all look identical, unless you know exactly which one is yours. I moved there about 2 years ago, right after a breakup, wanting a fresh start in a building where nobody knew my history. I'm careful. I want you to understand that about me before I tell you what happened, because I think it matters. I installed a video doorbell camera the week I moved in. Nothing fancy. Just one of those battery-powered ones that clips onto the frame and sends alerts to your phone. I check it almost every night before bed. It's become this small, automatic ritual, the same way some people check that the stove's off or the door's locked. I open the app. I scroll back through the day's motion clips. I make sure nothing looks out of place. And then I go to sleep. For 2 years, that ritual gave me exactly the peace of mind it was supposed to. Delivery driver, neighbors coming and going, my own reflection sometimes. Caught at a weird angle when I'd come home late and forgotten which way the camera pointed. Ordinary things, nothing that ever made me look twice. That changed on a Tuesday night in late October. I was doing my usual scroll through the day's clips, half paying attention, the way you do with a habit you've done 1,000 times before. And then I stopped on a clip time-stamped just after midnight hours, after I'd already gone to bed, showing a woman standing directly outside my door. She wasn't doing anything dramatic, not knocking, not trying the handle, just standing there, facing the camera, completely still. For the entire 8-second clip, the motion sensor had captured my first thought. And I want to be honest about how boring this thought was, is that it was probably my neighbor from 4C. An older woman who sometimes got turned around after a few too many glasses of wine at her book club. I didn't think much of it. I closed the app, told myself I'd mention it to her if I ran into her in the elevator, and went to bed without giving it much more thought than that. The next morning, out of nothing more than idle curiosity, I opened the app again to look at the clip a second time. I wanted to see if I could make out her face more clearly in better light on my screen. Maybe confirm it really was my neighbor. The clip was gone. Not just the specific one I remembered. The entire folder of motion clips from that night had vanished from my account, like they'd never been recorded at all. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I'm not a paranoid person by nature. I grew up the kind of practical that comes from watching my dad troubleshoot every gadget in our house instead of calling a repairman. And my first instinct, when the clip disappeared, wasn't fear. It was mild annoyance. The kind you feel when an app glitches on you for no good reason. I figured it was a syncing issue. Cloud storage apps drop things sometimes. I'd had it happen before with the photos. Files that vanished for a day and then mysteriously reappeared once the app updated itself. I made a mental note to check again later. Maybe restart my phone, and went about my day. It happened again 3 nights later. This time, the clip came through around 1:40 in the morning. Same still. silent shape of a woman standing directly in front of my door, facing the camera dead on. I noticed something different about her posture this time. Though in the first clip she'd been standing close enough that the camera mostly caught her from the shoulders up. But in this one, she was standing a little further back, far enough that I could see she was wearing dark clothing. Nothing distinct enough to make out details, but enough to tell she was of an average height, average build. Nothing about her screamed threat. She wasn't holding anything. She wasn't trying my door. Just standing there, watching the camera the way you'd watch someone through a window. I went to pull the clip up again the next morning to look more closely. And once again, it was gone. Not just from the app on my phone, I checked the account through my laptop too, thinking maybe it was a mobile app bug specifically, and found the exact same gap in the footage. An entire night's worth of clips missing, save for the one I'd apparently caught in that brief window before it disappeared. That's when the annoyance started curdling into something closer to unease. I called the camera company's customer support that afternoon, sitting on hold for the better part of 40 minutes before I got a real person. A young guy who sounded like he was working from a call center somewhere and reading off a script that didn't quite match what I was describing. He walked me through some basic troubleshooting, checking my account settings, confirming my subscription for cloud storage was active, making sure I hadn't accidentally set up an automatic deletion schedule. Everything checked out fine on his end, as far as he could tell. No deletion schedule, no storage issues, no obvious explanation for why footage would appear briefly and then vanish entirely from an account that, by every available metric, was working exactly the way it was supposed to. Sometimes there can be sync delays, he offered, though I could tell even he didn't fully believe it was a satisfying answer. If it happens again, try taking a screenshot of the clip right when you see it, just in case. I did exactly that from then on. Every night, before I went to sleep, I'd check the app, and if anything unusual came up, I'd screenshot it immediately rather than waiting until morning. It happened a third time. 4 nights after that. Same woman, same still, silent posture. But this, she wasn't standing outside my door at all. She was standing at the far end of the hallway, near the stairwell exit, facing my direction from a distance far enough away that in an ordinary clip, I might not have thought much of a stranger, simply passing through a shared hallway. Except she wasn't passing through. She was just standing there, motionless, for the entire clip, looking straight down the hall at my door from nearly 30 feet away. I screenshotted it immediately, hands a little unsteady, and this time, when I checked the next morning, the screenshot was still there on my phone. But the original clip in the app, once again, had vanished completely. I started sleeping worse after that. Not dramatically, I wasn't lying awake in a cold sweat every night, but enough that I noticed it. Enough that I started leaving a lamp on instead of total darkness. Enough that I found myself listening a little too closely to the ordinary sounds of an old building settling around me at night. The pattern kept going for almost 2 weeks. Not every single night, but often enough that I started to feel like I was being tested somehow, like whatever was happening wanted me to notice the rhythm of it without ever giving me a clean, continuous piece of evidence I could actually hold on to. Every clip vanished from the app within hours of my seeing it. My screenshots became the only record I had. A growing folder on my phone of increasingly strange, blurry images of a woman who never got any closer to my actual door again. After that third night, she just kept appearing at different points along the hallway. Sometimes near the stairwell, once by the elevator, always facing my direction, always still, like she was watching and waiting for something. I told my sister about it during one of our weekly calls, mostly because I needed to say it out loud to someone and hear how it sounded outside my own head. She took it more seriously than I expected, actually asked good, practical questions about the building's other security measures. Whether I'd talked to the building manager, whether I'd considered it might be someone specifically targeting me rather than some kind of random building intruder. I hadn't really let myself think about it in those terms before that conversation. Somehow, the idea that it might be personal, that this woman might be watching me, specifically, rather than just wandering the building for reasons that had nothing to do with me hadn't fully crystallized until my sister said it out loud. That night, unable to sleep, I went back through every screenshot I'd saved, laying them out side by side on my laptop screen, studying them more carefully than I had in the moment of panic each time they'd first appeared. And that's when I noticed the detail that changed everything. In the fourth screenshot, the one from the night she'd appeared by the elevator, I could make out her clothing more clearly than I had in any of the others. The image slightly better lit by the elevator's overhead fixture. A dark green cardigan, buttoned most of the way up. Black leggings, a particular scarf, gray with a thin burgundy stripe running along one edge, wrapped loosely around her neck. I sat there staring at that screenshot for a long time before the recognition fully landed. Because some part of my brain didn't want to accept what I was looking at. That was my outfit. Exactly my outfit. Down to the specific scarf, which had been a birthday gift from my mother 2 years earlier, and wasn't something I imagined many other women in Seattle happened to own in that exact color combination. I'd worn that outfit, that precise combination of cardigan, leggings, and scarf the day before that clip was recorded. I remembered it clearly because I'd taken a picture of myself in it before heading out to a coffee meeting with a friend. One of those quick mirror selfies you send to a group chat asking if an outfit works for the weather. I pulled up that selfie on my phone, held it next to the screenshot, and felt something go cold and hollow in my chest as I compared them side by side. It wasn't just similar clothing, it was identical. Down to the way the scarf was looped. Down to a small detail I only noticed because I was looking so closely. A loose thread near the cardigan's third button that I'd meant to snip off for weeks and kept forgetting about. Whoever this woman was, she wasn't just watching me from a distance. She had access to my closet. I called the police that same night, even though it was already past midnight, because I genuinely didn't feel safe waiting until morning. 2 officers came out to my building within the hour, and I walked them through everything. The disappearing clips, the screenshots I'd managed to save, and finally, the outfit. Laying my own selfie next to the screenshot on my kitchen table so they could see exactly what I'd noticed. One of the officers, a younger woman named Officer Delgado, took the clothing detail seriously in a way that made me feel, for the first time in 2 weeks, like I wasn't losing my mind. "That's not a coincidence I'd feel comfortable dismissing," she said, studying the 2 images carefully. "If someone has access to your closet, that's a significant escalation from just watching a hallway. We need to take this seriously." They did a full walkthrough of my apartment that night. Checking windows, checking the lock on my door, even checking inside closets and under furniture in a way that felt invasive, but that I was grateful for regardless. They didn't find any obvious signs of forced entry. My door lock looked untouched. No scratches around the keyhole. Nothing that suggested someone had picked it or forced their way in through conventional means. "We're going to need to look at your camera's account activity directly," the other officer told me. "Not just the app on your phone, the actual account logs from the manufacturer's server. If clips are disappearing the way you're describing, that's not something that happens through your phone app alone. Someone would need account-level access to actually delete footage like that." I contacted the camera company again the next morning, this time explaining that I had had police involvement and needed to speak to someone who could pull actual account access logs, not just run through basic troubleshooting. It took some persistence, a few transferred calls, but eventually I got connected to someone in what they called their trust and safety department. A woman who sounded considerably more alarmed once I explained the full situation, including the detail about the outfit. It took 3 days for them to get back to me with actual answers. 3 days I spent barely sleeping, checking my locks obsessively, staying with my sister 2 of those nights because I couldn't stand the thought of being alone in my apartment after dark. When the camera company finally called back, what they told me made the whole situation click into a shape I hadn't let myself consider until that moment. "Your account was accessed multiple times over the past 3 weeks from a device we can't associate with your registered devices," the trust and safety representative explained. Someone had valid login credentials, your actual username and password, and used them to view live footage from your camera, and in several instances, to delete specific clips shortly after they were recorded. How would someone get my login information? I asked. Though even as I said it, an uncomfortable possibility was already forming in my mind. Do you use the same password for multiple accounts? She asked. Or has anyone else ever had access to this account? A family member? A partner? Anyone you might have shared login details with at some point? I sat with that question for a long moment before answering. Because the truth. Once I let myself actually think it through, made my stomach drop in a way I hadn't expected. I had shared that password. Once. Over a year earlier. With my ex-boyfriend. Back when we were still together, and he'd helped me set up the camera system in the first place. Back before the breakup, that had actually been the reason I'd moved into this apartment to begin with. I hadn't changed that password since. I gave the police his name that same afternoon. Ethan Marsh. My ex of almost 3 years. Someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly 2 years since our breakup. Someone I genuinely hadn't thought about with any real frequency until that phone call forced me to. We'd ended things badly. Not dramatically. Just the slow, sad unraveling of a relationship that had run its course. But badly enough that we hadn't stayed in touch. Hadn't been the kind of exes who managed to become friends afterward. Officer Delgado took the information seriously. Told me they'd look into whether Ethan's IP address or device information matched any of the login activity the camera company had flagged. In the meantime, she strongly recommended I change every password I could think of that might have overlapped with anything he'd once had access to, and consider getting my apartment's locks changed as an added precaution. Even though there was no evidence yet of actual forced entry. I did both of those things immediately. I also, out of a paranoia I couldn't quite shake even after taking those precautions, started staying at my sister's place more nights than not, unable to fully relax in my own apartment while so much remained unresolved. It took another week for the police to come back with anything concrete. When Officer Delgado finally called, her voice carried a note of grim confirmation that told me, even before she said the words, that my suspicion had been right. The device used to access your account traces back to an IP address registered to Ethan Marsh's current residence, she said. We executed a search warrant this morning. I want to prepare you for what we found, because it's going to be difficult to hear. They'd found, on a laptop in his apartment, an extensive folder of saved footage pulled from my camera over the previous 3 weeks, not just the brief clips I'd caught glimpses of before they vanished, but apparently much more. Hours of footage he'd been quietly downloading and archiving, including footage from times of day I'd never even suspected anyone was watching. Footage of me coming and going, footage of deliveries, footage that painted a disturbingly complete picture of my daily patterns and routines. But that wasn't the detail that made my blood run cold. It was what else they found alongside. There's more, Officer Delgado said carefully. It appears he's been renting a storage unit for the past several months. He apparently used to keep various items clothing that matches items you own. Based on photos we're cross-referencing now, along with what looks like duplicate keys. Duplicate keys to what? I asked, though some part of me had already begun to guess the answer before she finished. We believe, based on what we're finding, that he made a copy of your apartment key at some point before your relationship ended, and never returned or destroyed it afterward. We're still working to confirm exactly how and when he may have used it. But given the clothing details, you noticed the specific outfit. Right down to a loose thread you mentioned, it's looking increasingly likely he had physical access to your apartment at some point, potentially copying or even briefly borrowing specific items in order to stage those camera appearances. I sat with the phone pressed against my ear, feeling the full weight of what she was describing settle over me in a way that made the room feel smaller, colder, less safe than it had felt even in my worst moments over the past 3 weeks. He hadn't just been watching me from a hallway. He'd been inside my apartment. He'd handled my clothes, memorized specific details, down to a thread I hadn't even bothered mentioning to anyone, besides my own reflection, and then staged an elaborate, months-long campaign of appearing on camera wearing versions of my own outfits. deleting the evidence almost as quickly as it appeared, engineering exactly the kind of unsettling, impossible-seeming mystery that had kept me awake and frightened and increasingly convinced I might be losing touch with reality. They arrested Ethan 2 days later. Officer Delgado called to let me know, walking me through the charges they were pursuing: unauthorized computer access, stalking, and given the evidence of the copied key and apparent unauthorized entry into my apartment, burglary charges as well, though she was careful to explain that the exact scope of what he'd be formally charged with would depend on further investigation and what the prosecutor's office decided to pursue. I asked, because I needed to understand it, even if the answer wasn't going to make me feel any better, why he'd done it. What could possibly explain 3 weeks of elaborate, invasive theater, deleting footage almost as fast as he uploaded himself into frame, staging appearances in my own clothing just to unsettle me in increasingly specific ways? He gave a statement. Officer Delgado told me. Her voice, careful in the way I'd come to recognize, meant she was about to tell me something that wasn't going to sit easily. He claims he still had feelings for you, that he'd been struggling since the breakup, and that this started as what he described as checking in on you through the camera using the old login he still had. According to his statement, once he realized you weren't changing the password, he began escalating, first just watching, then eventually using the spare key he'd never returned to occasionally enter your apartment when he knew you'd be out, taking pictures of specific outfits, and staging the camera appearances as a way of, in his words, making you feel like you weren't alone. I didn't know what to do with a statement like that. It didn't sound like remorse. It sounded like someone explaining a twisted logic that had made complete sense inside his own head. A logic built entirely around his own loneliness and need for connection, with absolutely no regard for what 3 weeks of that connection had actually done to me the sleepless nights. The growing conviction that I might be losing my grip on reality. The fear that had followed me into every corner of what was supposed to be my safest, most private space. "There's one more thing," Officer Delgado said. Before we ended that call, in his statement, he specifically mentioned the footage where you noticed the outfit, the one that made you realize someone had access to your closet. He said that was actually a mistake on his part. He'd meant for you to notice it eventually. Wanted you to know someone was paying that close attention to you. But he panicked once you actually involved the police. Worried that clip in particular would be too easy to trace back. He says he was trying to delete that one specifically, faster than the others. But the timing worked out in your favor. You saved that screenshot before he managed to get to it. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. How close the whole thing had come to staying an unsolved mystery. A strange, unexplained pattern I might have eventually convinced myself to just live with. The way so many of us learn to live with unease we can't fully name or prove. If I hadn't happened to screenshot that particular clip in that particular moment. If I hadn't happened to compare it against a selfie I'd taken almost as an afterthought the day before. I don't know how much longer this could have gone on. How much longer I might have spent doubting my own perception of what was happening in my own home. I moved out of that apartment within a month, breaking my lease with a police report and a restraining order to back up my request, both of which the building manager accepted without much argument once he understood the full situation. I found a new place, in a different neighborhood entirely. One I chose specifically because Ethan had never once been there, had no history with the building, no old memory of the layout or the hallway or which door was mine. I changed every password I owned that week, not just the camera app, and I've never once shared login credentials with a partner since. No matter how far a relationship goes, no matter how much trust I think I've built with someone. That particular lesson, I learned the hardest way I think I ever will. The months after the arrest were harder than I expected them to be, in ways that surprised me, given that the actual danger had, technically, been resolved. I'd assumed that once the police had a name, once Ethan had been arrested and charged, once I'd moved somewhere he'd never been, the fear would start to fade on its own. Instead, I found myself carrying a different, quieter kind of unease into my new apartment, not fear of Ethan specifically anymore, but a broader, harder to name distrust of my own sense of safety. I started seeing a therapist that winter. Something I probably should have done years earlier for entirely unrelated reasons. But this particular experience finally pushed me into actually making the appointment. She helped me understand something about the whole ordeal that I hadn't fully articulated to myself before. That part of what had made those 3 weeks so destabilizing wasn't just the fear of being watched, but the specific way Ethan had engineered the situation to make me doubt my own perception of reality. The vanishing clips, the impossible seeming detail of the outfit, the slow escalation designed, deliberately, to make me feel like I might be losing my grip on what was actually happening around me. That's a particular kind of harm, she told me during one of our early sessions. It's not just a stalking in the conventional sense. It's a version of it specifically built around undermining your trust in your own observations, your own memory, your own instincts. That kind of psychological targeting can be even harder to recover from than more straightforward threats, because it attacks the very tool you'd normally use to protect yourself. Your ability to trust what you're seeing and feeling. That reframing helped me more than I expected it to. It gave me language for something I'd been struggling to name why, even months after the danger had passed. I still found myself second-guessing ordinary moments. Still found myself checking and rechecking locks. Still felt a flicker of doubt whenever something small seemed slightly off. Wondering if I was noticing something real or manufacturing patterns out of residual anxiety. I did eventually testify against Ethan. Once the case moved forward toward what became a plea agreement rather than a full trial, he pled guilty to stalking and unlawful entry, avoiding some of the more serious burglary charges in exchange for a plea, and received a sentence that included both jail time and a lengthy period of mandatory supervision afterward, along with a permanent restraining order that would follow him regardless of where either of us eventually ended up living. I won't pretend that sentence felt like enough. In the moment, some part of me had wanted something more dramatic. Some cleaner sense of justice that would match the scale of fear he'd put me through. But my therapist helped me understand that closure rarely arrives in the shape we expect it to, and that focusing on the sentence itself, rather than on my own healing, wasn't going to be the thing that actually helped me move forward. I did eventually reach out to my sister to properly thank her, months later, for the offhand comment that had first shifted my thinking during that early phone call. The simple observation that maybe this was personal. Maybe it was specifically about me, rather than some random building intruder. That one small reframing had eventually led me to look at those screenshots more carefully, to notice the outfit, to piece together the detail that broke the whole case open. If she hadn't planted that seed, I genuinely don't know how much longer I would have kept explaining the whole thing away as some strange, unexplainable glitch, rather than recognizing it as the calculated, deeply personal violation it actually was. It's been almost 2 years now since everything happened, and I think enough time has passed that I can look back on it with something closer to perspective than I had in those raw first months. I'm in a healthier place these days, both in terms of my own mental state and in terms of the practical safety measures I've built into my life since. I still live in that second apartment, the one Ethan never had any history with, and I've made a handful of changes to how I approach privacy and security that I don't think I'll ever fully abandon, even years removed from the actual danger. I use a password manager now, something I'd always meant to set up and never quite got around to before all of this happened. Every account has its own unique, complicated password, and I've made it a firm personal rule, non-negotiable regardless of how serious a relationship becomes, that I never share login credentials for anything connected to my home security. It sounds like such a small, almost paranoid precaution when I say it out loud, but I think about how easily this entire situation could have been avoided if I'd simply changed one password after a breakup. And it doesn't feel paranoid to me anymore. It feels like basic maintenance, the digital equivalent of changing your locks after a relationship ends. Something I think a lot of us don't consider seriously enough until something forces us to. I've also become, admittedly, someone who pays much closer attention to the small inconsistencies in my daily life than I ever used to before. I don't think that's entirely a bad thing, even though it sometimes edges towards something my therapist and I have had to actively manage together. There's a difference. She's helped me understand between healthy vigilance and anxiety that spiraled past its usefulness. And learning to tell the difference has been its own ongoing project in the years since. I talked to Officer Delgado one final time, close to a year after the arrest, mostly just to check in and thank her properly for how seriously she'd taken the whole situation from that very first late-night visit to my apartment. She told me something during that conversation that has stuck with me since. Something I think about often when I hear other people describe strange, unsettling situations they've talked themselves out of investigating further. The cases that scare me most, she said, aren't usually the ones with an obvious, dramatic threat attached to them from the start. They're the ones like yours where everything looks small and explainable at first. Where the person experiencing it talks themselves out of taking it seriously for weeks, sometimes months, because each individual piece seems too minor to justify the disruption of actually pushing for answers. By the time people finally do push, sometimes the situation has already escalated much further than it needed to. I think about that conversation often, especially now. Whenever I catch myself explaining away some small inconsistency in my own life with the easiest, least alarming interpretation available. I don't think that instinct toward calm, rational explanation is inherently wrong most of the time. Genuinely. Boring explanations really are the correct ones. Cameras really do glitch sometimes. Neighbors really do wander to the wrong door after too much wine. I don't want to leave you with the impression that every strange notification or unexplained sound deserves a full investigation and a call to the police. But I do think there's a version of vigilance worth holding on to. A willingness to keep asking questions even after the first, easiest explanation presents itself, especially when something continues happening in a pattern rather than as a single isolated incident. I gave myself 2 full weeks of uncertainty before I finally let myself take the whole thing seriously enough to properly investigate. And looking back, I think about how much of that time Ethan spent inside my actual apartment, handling my belongings, studying details about my life closely enough to replicate a loose thread on a cardigan button. While I was still telling myself it was probably nothing. I want to end this by saying something directly to anyone listening who might be experiencing a version of what I went through. Even if the specific details look nothing like mine, maybe it's not a camera. Maybe it's a strange feeling every time you walk into your apartment. A sense that something's been moved slightly out of place. A persistent, nagging discomfort you've been talking yourself out of for weeks because you don't have concrete proof yet. Because the idea of being wrong feels more embarrassing than the idea of being right, feels frightening. I understand that instinct better than almost anyone, because I lived inside it for nearly 3 weeks before I finally let myself take my own discomfort seriously. I want to tell you, as directly as I can, that the discomfort itself is data. It's not something to explain away just because you don't yet have a clean, provable reason for feeling it. Trust that instinct enough to actually investigate it. Even if investigating feels disruptive. Even if it feels like you're overreacting to something that might turn out to be entirely innocent. I also want to say something about the specific shape this particular danger took, because I think it matters beyond just my own story. We live so much of our private lives now through devices we trust implicitly. Cameras, smart locks, apps connected to accounts we set up once and rarely think about again. Those tools genuinely do make us safer. Most of the time. And I'm not telling you to distrust every piece of technology in your home. But I am telling you that the same access that makes those tools useful to you can, in the wrong hands, become a tool used against you instead. If you've ever shared login credentials with a partner, especially for anything connected to your home security, and that relationship has since ended, please, take the 20 minutes it requires to change those passwords, I promise you. It's a smaller inconvenience than anything I went through, learning that lesson the hard way. I think, in the end, what still unsettles me most about the whole experience isn't even the fear I felt during those 3 weeks, real as that fear was. It's the quieter realization that came afterward that someone I had once trusted completely, someone I had shared a home and a life with for years, was capable of using that intimate knowledge of me not to reconnect, not to reach out honestly and ask for what he wanted, but to engineer an elaborate campaign specifically designed to make me doubt my own mind. That's a different kind of violation than a stranger breaking in ever could have been. It came from someone who knew exactly which details would unsettle me most. Precisely because he'd once known me well enough to love me. I don't know if there's a clean, comforting lesson to take from that particular part of the story. I think, if anything, it's just a reminder that the people capable of hurting us most deeply are often the ones who once had the most legitimate access to our lives. Which is exactly why it's worth being deliberate, even in healthy relationships, about where you draw lines around your own privacy and security. Not because you expect betrayal, but because protecting yourself shouldn't have to depend on predicting who might eventually deserve less trust than you once gave them. I sleep well most nights now, in my new apartment, with my new passwords, and my new, more careful relationship to the small, ordinary technologies I depend on every day. But I still check my camera every night before bed, the same ritual I've kept since I first moved to Seattle. It doesn't feel like fear anymore when I do it. It feels like something closer to respect for the discomfort I once ignored for far too long, and for the version of myself who finally learned to trust it before it was too late. My name's Marcus Webb. I'm 32 years old, and about a year ago, I moved into a new apartment on the north side of Chicago. One of those old pre-war buildings with thick walls and creaky radiators. The kind of place that's got character, sure, but also comes with 100 years of other people's history baked into the plaster. I'd just gotten out of a relationship that ended badly. Needed a fresh start somewhere I hadn't lived with somebody else. And this place fit the bill. 3rd floor, 1 bedroom, decent light in the mornings. The rent was reasonable for the neighborhood, which should have been my first clue that something wasn't quite right. But I didn't think much of it at the time. Chicago rent is Chicago rent. You take what you can get. The building itself had maybe 20 units. Most of them occupied by what I gathered were long-term tenants, older folks, a few young couples. One guy on the 2nd floor who ran some kind of vintage record business out of his apartment. Friendly enough building, all things considered. Thin walls, like I said, but nothing that ever bothered me much. You hear footsteps overhead. Somebody's TV a little too loud on a weekend night. Normal apartment stuff. The unit right next to mine, 3B, was supposedly empty when I moved in. The leasing agent mentioned it in passing something about the previous tenant moving out unexpectedly. The unit needing some work before it could go back on the market. But I didn't think anything of it. Empty apartment next door sounded like a bonus to me, honestly. Less noise, more privacy. That lasted about 3 weeks. It started small, the way these things always do, I guess. Around 2, sometimes 3 in the morning. I'd wake up to this sound coming through the wall that shared my bedroom with 3B, a dragging noise. Heavy, like furniture being pulled slowly across a wood floor. Not loud enough to be alarming. Exactly. Just loud enough to pull me out of sleep and leave me lying there in the dark, listening. My first thought, the reasonable thought, was that somebody had finally moved in and just hadn't bothered introducing themselves yet. Maybe they worked nights. Maybe they were doing some renovation work at odd hours, because that's when the contractor could fit them in. Chicago's full of people with weird schedules. I didn't think much of it. It kept happening, though, not every night, but often enough that I started to notice a pattern, always between 2 and 3. Always that same dragging sound. Sometimes accompanied by what I told myself was just the settling of an old building. Creaks and pops that didn't necessarily mean anything at all. I actually knocked on the door of 3B one afternoon. thinking I'd introduce myself to whoever my new neighbor was, maybe smooth over any awkwardness about the noise before it became a real issue between us. Nobody answered. I figured they were probably at work. Tried again a couple of days later at a different time. Still nothing. It wasn't until about a month in that things stopped feeling like an ordinary annoyance and started feeling like something else entirely. I was lying awake one night, couldn't sleep. One of those restless nights everybody gets sometimes, when I heard it. Not the dragging sound this time. Crying. A woman. Crying softly on the other side of that wall. The kind of quiet, exhausted crying. That sounds like it's been going on a lot longer than however long I'd actually been listening to it. I sat up in bed, completely still, straining to hear more, half convinced I was imagining it, half terrified that I wasn't. It lasted maybe 2 minutes before it just stopped. No door closing, no footsteps walking away. Just silence, sudden and complete, like someone had turned it off. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, I went straight down to the building's management office before I even had coffee in me. Our building manager, a guy named Roy, who'd apparently been running the place for something like 15 years, was sitting behind his cluttered desk with a mug of something that smelled like it had been sitting there since sunrise. "Hey, Roy," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, even though I hadn't slept much. "Question about 3B, next to me. Somebody move in recently." Roy looked up from whatever paperwork he'd been squinting at and gave me this look, half confused, half like he was trying to remember something. "3B's been empty for a while now," he said. 6 months, maybe longer. Previous tenant broke her lease, moved out real sudden. We've had some water damage in there we've been meaning to fix, so it's just been sitting. Nobody's in there right now at all. Not that I know of. Why? You hearing something? I told him about the dragging noise, the footsteps, and after a moment's hesitation, because saying it out loud made it feel more real and more insane at the same time, the crying I'd heard the night before. Roy's expression shifted into something a little more careful. The look of a guy who's had this conversation before and doesn't love having it again. "Look, that building's old. Walls settle, pipes make noise. Sound travels weird through places built before World War II. I wouldn't read too much into it. It sounded like a person. Roy, a woman crying. That's not pipes." I didn't have a great answer for that. He told me he'd send someone up to check the unit. Make sure nothing weird was going on. Maybe a homeless person had found a way in, he said. Which honestly didn't make me feel much better than the alternative. I left his office without much reassurance either way. And that whole day, I couldn't shake the memory of that crying. The particular exhausted quality of it, like whoever it belonged to had been at it for a very long time before I ever started listening. Nobody came to check the unit that I ever saw, at least not right away. Maintenance requests in old buildings like that have a way of falling through the cracks. And I guess mine did too. The noises kept happening, almost every night now, not just occasionally, the dragging sound. Sometimes what I swore were footsteps pacing slowly back and forth. And twice more over the following 2 weeks. That same soft crying, always stopping abruptly, always leaving me wide awake and unsettled in the dark. I started sleeping with a light on, which I hadn't done since I was a kid, feeling a little embarrassed about it, even though nobody was there to see. I started paying closer attention to the wall itself, running my hand along it sometimes during the day, feeling for anything unusual. Though, of course, I never found anything, just old plaster. Slightly uneven, the way old plaster always is, giving away nothing about whatever was happening on the other side of it at night. The footsteps were the part that really started getting to me. Because unlike the dragging sound, unlike even the crying, the footsteps had a very specific pattern I couldn't stop noticing once I'd noticed it the first time. They would come from somewhere deeper in the apartment, cross the room in a slow, deliberate way, and then stop always in the exact same spot, right up against the wall that separated 3B from my bedroom, right up against the wall on the other side of where my bed was pushed. They'd just stop there, sometimes for a full minute, sometimes longer. This heavy, waiting silence that felt so much worse than any sound could have. And then, eventually, they'd move away again, back into wherever they'd come from, and the apartment would go quiet until the next night. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself old buildings creak. That sound does strange things, traveling through decades-old plaster and wood. That a supposedly empty apartment couldn't possibly have someone standing in it every single night, listening, because that's exactly what it felt like. Even though I couldn't have told you why, it felt like listening. Like someone was standing on the other side of that wall, close enough that I could almost feel them there. And they were listening to me the same way I was straining to listen to them. I didn't sleep well for weeks. And then one evening, doing something completely unrelated, just trying to plug in a lamp near my bed, I found the detail that changed everything. I was on my knees behind my nightstand, trying to get the lamp cord into an outlet that was awkwardly positioned low on the wall, right at the base of the shared wall with 3B. It was a Sunday evening, nothing special about it, and I wasn't thinking about the noises at all in that moment. Just annoyed at myself for buying a lamp with a cord too short for where I wanted to put it. That's when I heard it. Not the dragging sound, not footsteps, a whisper, coming from the outlet itself. I froze there on my knees, cord still in my hand, absolutely certain I'd imagined it. The way your mind plays tricks on you sometimes in a quiet apartment late in the evening. I leaned in closer, put my ear almost right up against the outlet plate, feeling ridiculous and terrified in equal measure. It happened again, faint, garbled, impossible to make out actual words, but unmistakably a human voice, low and continuous, like someone talking to themselves, or maybe talking to someone else in a room I couldn't see. It seemed to be coming from somewhere behind the wall itself, not from 3B directly, but from somewhere inside the wall structure, which didn't make any sense to me at all, and made the whole thing feel even worse for not making sense. I sat back on my heels, heart going hard in my chest, and just listened for a long time. The whispering came and went, sometimes disappearing entirely for stretches of several minutes, sometimes picking back up so quiet I had to hold my breath to be sure I wasn't imagining it. I didn't sleep in that bedroom again that night. I took a blanket to the couch, left every light in the apartment on, and spent most of the night scrolling through my phone, trying to convince myself there was some ordinary explanation, old wiring picking up radio signals, some electrical interference from another unit, anything that would let me feel like a rational adult instead of someone hearing voices come out of the wall. The next morning, I called an electrician instead of going back to Roy. I figured if nothing else, whatever was happening with that outlet was worth having a professional take a look at. And if it turned out to be nothing more than faulty wiring, at least I'd have some peace of mind about it. The electrician who came out was a guy named Pete. Older, the kind of unhurried, methodical tradesman who's clearly seen 100 old Chicago buildings and isn't easily rattled by any of them. I explained what I'd heard, feeling foolish saying it out loud to a stranger. But Pete just nodded along, like it wasn't the strangest thing he'd been asked to investigate. He pulled the outlet cover off, checked the wiring behind it, ran some kind of tester over the connections. Everything checked out fine electrically. He told me no faults, no obvious explanation for any sound coming through it. Sometimes old buildings have weird acoustics, he said, echoing almost exactly what Roy had told me weeks earlier. Sound travels through pipes, through gaps in old construction, comes out in strange places. Doesn't necessarily mean there's a problem. I told him about the dragging sounds too. The footsteps that always stopped right at this same section of wall. The crying I'd heard on multiple occasions. Pete got a little more thoughtful after that, running his hand along the wall itself, tapping at it in a few places with his knuckles, listening to the sound it made. Huh, he said, tapping again a little further to the left. That's odd. What? This section here sounds different than the rest of the wall. Hollow, almost. Not unusual on its own. Sometimes there's a chase for old plumbing or wiring runs, but the way it's positioned, right along this whole stretch. He trailed off, tapping again, moving along the wall in a slow line. his expression growing more focused with every few inches. "Different how?" I asked, feeling that same cold unease start creeping back into my chest. Pete straightened up, looking at me with the careful expression of a man about to say something he suspected I wasn't going to want to hear. "I think there might be a gap back there, a void of some kind, between your unit and the one next door, wider than you'd normally expect for just wiring or plumbing. If you're serious about figuring out what's causing these sounds, I think we need to open this wall up and take a proper look." I said yes before I'd even fully thought it through, which in hindsight probably tells you how badly those weeks of bad sleep and creeping dread had worn on me. Pete said he'd need to bring in a second guy, somebody who did more general contracting work, since opening a wall properly wasn't strictly electrical work. And he didn't want to leave me with a hole in my bedroom and no idea how to close it back up. They came out 2 days later, a Wednesday morning. Pete and a heavyset contractor named Doug, who talked a lot less but seemed to know exactly what he was doing. I took the day off work to be there, telling myself it was just curiosity. Though, honestly, by that point, I don't think I could have stayed away even if I'd tried. Something in me needed to see whatever was on the other side of that wall. They started cutting into the plaster right around where the outlet was, right around the section Pete had identified as sounding hollow. It didn't take them long to confirm what he'd suspected behind the drywall and the old lath and plaster. There was, in fact, a gap. Not just wiring space, not just a plumbing chase, an actual void, maybe 2.5 feet deep, running vertically along a significant stretch of the shared wall between my unit and 3B. "That's not normal construction," Doug said, shining a flashlight into the opening they'd made, his voice carrying a note of genuine confusion. "This building wasn't designed with a gap like this. Somebody built this in later, framed it out deliberately." I stood there in my bedroom, watching them widen the hole enough to get a better look, feeling something cold and sick settling in my stomach as the flashlight beam swept across the inside of that narrow space. It wasn't just empty. There were things in there. A sleeping bag, rolled up neatly against one wall of the gap, a small battery-powered lantern, empty water bottles, stacked with a kind of careful order that made my skin crawl worse than if they'd just been scattered around. And drawings, dozens of them, taped to the interior wall of the space. At first glance, almost decorative, until I looked closer and understood, with a wave of nausea, exactly what they were. They were drawings of me, my apartment, me sleeping in my bed, me sitting at my kitchen table, me getting dressed in the mornings, dozens of small, careful sketches, done in pencil, capturing ordinary moments of my daily life with an unsettling attention to detail. Some of them looked recent. Some of them, judging by details like an old shirt I hadn't worn in months, looked like they went back to nearly the beginning of my time in that apartment. Doug had gone very quiet, and Pete had stepped back from the opening entirely, both of them clearly understanding, at the same moment I did, that we weren't looking at some strange architectural quirk or an old, abandoned storage space. We were looking at somewhere someone had been living, somewhere someone had been watching me from for months. Close enough to hear everything. Close enough to draw the small details of my life from memory with unsettling accuracy. "I'm calling the police," Pete said, already pulling out his phone, his voice tight with something between anger and unease. Nobody touch anything else in there. I backed out of my own bedroom, out into the hallway, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, staring back at that dark opening in my wall like it might do something on its own if I looked away for even a second. Everything I'd heard over the past 2 months, the dragging, the footsteps that always stopped right against that wall, the whispering, even that terrible crying, all of it came rushing back with a new and horrifying clarity. It hadn't been paranormal. It hadn't been an empty apartment settling with age. Someone had been living inside my wall. The police arrived within 20 minutes. And what had started as a quiet Wednesday morning turned into something closer to a small-scale investigation. 2 officers first, then a detective, then eventually a small crew of crime scene technicians who spent hours documenting that narrow space behind my bedroom wall with a thoroughness that made the whole thing feel even more real, even more impossible to explain away. I sat in my kitchen while they worked, wrapped in a blanket, despite the fact that it wasn't cold, answering the same questions over and over for different officers. How long had I lived there? When had the noises started? Had I ever seen anyone? Had I ever felt like I was being watched? That last question stopped me every time, because the honest answer was yes. More times than I could count over the past 2 months. And I'd talked myself out of trusting that feeling every single time. The detective who eventually took the lead on my case was a woman named Detective Ruiz. Sharp and direct in a way I appreciated, given how disoriented I felt by then. She explained, once they'd finished the initial search of the void, that they'd need to access 3B directly as well, since the space clearly connected the 2 units, and that management had already been contacted to let them in. It turned out the gap ran the full length of both bedrooms, wide enough for a person to move through in a low crouch, with a second, smaller entrance on the 3B side that had apparently been concealed behind a section of built-in closet shelving, something easy enough to miss during a cursory inspection, especially in a unit that had officially been sitting vacant and unvisited for months. We found more of the same in there, Detective Ruiz told me, once the initial search was mostly complete. Food wrappers, more sketches, some clothing. It looks like whoever was using this space had access to both units, moving freely between the gap and 3B itself. Since that unit's been empty, we don't think they had regular access into your apartment directly, which is something, at least. But they clearly had eyes and ears on you almost constantly. How long? I asked. How long do you think someone was actually in there? Based on some of the material we're finding, we think at least 4 months, possibly longer. It's hard to say exactly without more analysis. 4 months. I did the math almost without meaning to, and the number made me feel physically ill nearly the entire length of time I'd lived in that apartment. Someone had been in that wall, close enough to hear me breathing at night, close enough to draw my face from memory, close enough that on some nights, standing right up against that thin barrier of plaster and lath, they might have been no more than a foot or 2 away from me while I slept. Utterly unaware, I asked the question I'd been almost too afraid to voice out loud. Do you know who it was? Detective Ruiz's expression shifted into something more careful before she answered. The particular look of someone about to deliver information they know is going to be difficult to hear. We found identification among the belongings in the void, she said. We believe this was a woman named Denise Kowalski, 41 years old, according to building records. She was actually the previous tenant of 3B, the one who supposedly broke her lease and moved out abruptly about 6 months before you moved in. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something click into place that made an already disturbing situation feel almost unbearably sad on top of everything else. She never actually left, I said slowly. She just moved into the wall. That's what it looks like. Detective Ruiz confirmed. We're still piecing together exactly, but based on some of what we found, journal entries, prescription bottles for medication that appears to have gone unfilled. For some time, we believe she may have been experiencing a serious mental health crisis around the time she was supposed to move out, instead of actually leaving the building. It looks like she found this space, likely already existing from some previous renovation work, and made the decision to stay hidden inside it, rather than go wherever she was originally headed. And the crying I heard, I said quietly, already sensing the answer before I finished asking. That was her? Detective Ruiz nodded. Almost certainly. We think she was in real distress for a significant portion of the time she was in there. Isolated. Likely off any medication she might have needed. Watching a stranger live an ordinary life on the other side of a wall, she couldn't bring herself to leave. I didn't know what to say to that. Some part of me had been braced for something more like a predator. Some deliberate stalker who'd chosen me specifically and planned every detail of getting close to me. What I got instead was something sadder and stranger. A woman in crisis. Hidden and suffering. Close enough to touch and completely unknown to me the entire time. Her tears the only honest sound in months of noises I'd tried so hard to explain away. It took the police almost 3 days to actually locate Denise. She wasn't in the wall. When they searched it, hadn't been for at least a week or two, based on the state of the food wrappers and the layer of dust that had settled over some of her belongings. Wherever she'd gone, she'd left most of what she owned behind, which Detective Ruiz told me was actually a good sign in terms of finding her quickly, since it suggested she hadn't planned a long-term disappearance, hadn't taken the kind of care someone running deliberately would take. They found her, eventually, at a shelter downtown, about 4 miles from the building, where she'd apparently been staying for a little over a week under her own name, no attempt to hide. No elaborate cover story, just a woman who'd walked out of a hidden space in a wall and into the first place that would take her in without asking too many questions. Detective Ruiz called to update me once they'd made contact, though she was careful about how much she could actually share given the sensitivity of what was clearly an ongoing mental health situation rather than a straightforward criminal case. She's been taken in for an evaluation, Detective Ruiz told me over the phone. Given everything we found, the duration, the apparent state she was in, this is likely going to be handled as much through mental health services as through the criminal justice system. At least initially. There will still be charges related to unlawful entry and the surveillance itself. But the DA's office is working closely with a psychiatric team to figure out the right path forward. Did she say anything? I asked. About why about me, specifically. There was a pause before Detective Ruiz answered, and I got the sense she was deciding how much to actually tell me. From what I understand, she wasn't entirely coherent when they found her, but she did say some things about you. Nothing that suggested any specific plan to hurt you, if that's what you're worried about. It sounds more like she'd built a kind of relationship in her mind, watching you live your life. She apparently referred to you a few times as her only friend. I don't think anything anyone said to me during that entire ordeal hit me quite as hard as that sentence did. Her only friend. A woman I had never once met, never spoken to, never even glimpsed, and somewhere in the isolation and crisis she'd been living through. In that narrow, dark space behind my bedroom wall, I had become the closest thing she had to human connection. Watching me sleep, watching me get dressed for work, watching me eat dinner alone most nights after my breakup, and somehow, in the loneliest and most broken part of her mind, building something out of that one-sided closeness that she'd apparently come to depend on. I didn't know how to feel about that. Part of me, a large part, honestly still felt violated in a way I don't think I'll ever fully shake. The knowledge that someone had been that close to me, that intimately aware of my private life, without my consent or even my awareness that she existed at all. But another part of me, a part that surprised me by how strong it was, felt a genuine, aching sadness for her, for whatever had brought her to a place where hiding in a wall and watching a stranger felt safer or more bearable than whatever waited for her on the outside of it. I moved out of that apartment within the month. I couldn't stay. Not after everything, every creak of the building, every ordinary sound an old apartment makes, had taken on a weight I didn't know how to carry anymore. Management was understanding about breaking my lease, all things considered, probably eager to avoid any further attention on a situation that hadn't exactly reflected well on their oversight of an empty unit. I found a new place a few months later, a newer building this time. Thinner walls in some ways, but at least honest ones, no hidden voids. No old renovation gaps large enough for someone to disappear into. I checked, obsessively. The first week I moved in, running my hands along every wall in the bedroom like I half expected to find something even in a building barely 10 years old. I never did hear what ultimately happened with Denise's case. Whether she got the help she clearly needed. Whether the charges against her were fully pursued or handled some other way, given the circumstances. Detective Ruiz told me, near the end of our last conversation, that these situations rarely have a clean resolution. That mental health crises this severe don't just end because the immediate danger has passed. I think about her sometimes, more than I expected to given everything that happened. Not with anger. Most days, though I won't pretend that feeling never surfaces, mostly with a kind of uneasy sympathy. I still don't fully understand myself for a woman whose isolation ran so deep that watching a stranger live an ordinary life through a crack in a wall, became the closest thing she had left to companionship. In the weeks after I moved out, I found myself replaying the whole thing obsessively, trying to understand not just what had happened, but all the small moments I'd missed or explained away that, looking back, seemed obvious in a way that made my skin crawl. The dragging sound I'd heard that first week, I understood now. It had probably been her moving supplies into the space, setting up whatever makeshift shelter she'd built for herself in those first days after she was supposed to have moved out for good. The footsteps that always stopped right against my bedroom wall, lingering there for a minute or more before moving away. I understood that too. Now, in a way that made me feel sick every time I thought about it. She hadn't been pacing randomly. She'd been standing there, on the other side of a few inches of plaster, listening to me sleep. I started seeing a therapist about a month after I moved, which wasn't something I'd ever done before. But between the breakup that had preceded all of this, and then the apartment situation on top of it, I didn't feel like I had much choice. She helped me work through a lot of what I was feeling, the anger, obviously, but also that strange, unwanted sympathy that kept surfacing whenever I thought about Denise. And the harder-to-name feeling of having my privacy violated in a way that went beyond anything I'd ever had language for before. It makes sense that you're struggling to categorize this, my therapist told me during one of our early sessions. Most people who go through something like a stalking situation can hold on to anger cleanly, because there's usually a clear villain, someone acting with malicious intent. What you went through doesn't fit that shape as neatly. You were violated, genuinely and seriously, and at the same time. The person responsible was in a level of crisis that makes it hard to just be angry at her the way you might be angry at someone who did this with clear predatory intent. Both things can be true. You can hold both feelings at once. That helped, more than I expected it to. It gave me permission to stop trying to force my feelings about the whole situation into one clean, simple shape. I did eventually learn a little more about what happened to Denise, though not through any official channel through, of all things. A mutual connection I discovered almost by accident. A woman who'd apparently known her years earlier through a support group for people dealing with anxiety and depression. She reached out to me after seeing a local news story about the incident, which had gotten a small amount of coverage given how unusual it was, and told me, gently, some of what she knew. Denise had been struggling for years before any of this happened. She told me, a difficult divorce, the loss of a job she'd held for over a decade, and finally, in the months before she was supposed to move out of 3B, the death of her mother, who had apparently been her primary source of emotional support through everything else. The combination had sent her into a depth of isolation and crisis that, according to this woman, none of her old friends had fully understood was happening, because Denise had gradually stopped reaching out to anyone at all in the months leading up to her disappearance. She used to talk, back in the group, about feeling invisible, the woman told me, like nobody would notice if she just disappeared one day. I think, in her mind, hiding in that wall might have actually felt like the opposite of that. Like she'd found one person whose life she could still be a part of, even if it was only from the other side of a wall he didn't know she was behind. I don't know exactly what to do with that information, even now. I don't think it excuses what happened. And my therapist has been careful to help me hold that boundary, understanding. Someone's pain doesn't erase the harm their actions caused. And I don't owe Denise forgiveness or absolution, just because her reasons turned out to be sadder than I expected. But it did help me understand, at least, the shape of what had happened to me, and why it felt so different from the straightforward danger I'd initially feared. I still think, sometimes, about how close I came to never finding out at all. If Pete hadn't happened to notice that hollow sound in the wall. If I'd talked myself into believing, the way I nearly did more than once, that the noises really were just an old building settling, nothing worth pursuing any further. I think about all the nights I lay awake, certain something was wrong, and how easily I could have simply continued ignoring that certainty, The way so many of us are trained to do, when our instincts don't have a clean, rational explanation attached to them yet. It's been a little over a year now since I moved out of that apartment, and I think enough time has passed that I can look back on the whole experience with something closer to clarity than I had in those first raw weeks afterward. I'm settled into my new place. I've been dating someone for a few months now who knows the whole story and has been remarkably understanding about my slightly obsessive habit of checking walls in any new space we spend time in together. And life has, for the most part, gone back to something resembling normal. But I don't think I'll ever fully lose the particular kind of vigilance that whole experience left me with. I notice things now that I never used to pay attention to before, outlets that seem slightly off. Sections of wall that sound just a little different when I knock on them. That instinctive, prickling feeling of being watched that I used to dismiss so easily and now take seriously every single time it surfaces. I think that's actually the thing I most want to pass along to anyone hearing this story, more than the details of what happened or how strange and specific this particular situation turned out to be. It's this trust the discomfort. Trust the small, nagging feeling that something isn't right, even when every rational explanation you can come up with seems more likely than the frightening one. I spent nearly 2 months explaining away sounds that turned out to have one of the most disturbing explanations I could have imagined, because an old building settling felt so much more plausible, so much easier to accept than the alternative. I talked to Detective Ruiz one more time, a few months after everything wrapped up, mostly just to check in and see if there was any update on how Denise was doing, though I understood by then that she likely couldn't share much given privacy concerns around ongoing mental health treatment. She did tell me one thing, though, that has stuck with me since that situations like mine, while unusual in the specific details, aren't actually as rare as people assume. People slipping into forgotten or overlooked spaces within buildings, whether out of desperation, mental health crisis, or sometimes more predatory intent, happens more often than most of us would ever want to believe, especially in older cities with older housing stock full of renovations, additions, and architectural quirks that nobody's fully documented or accounted for anymore. The lesson most people take from something like this, she told me, is to be more suspicious of strangers, more careful about locks and security systems. And that's not wrong, exactly. But I think the real lesson is usually simpler than that. It's about paying attention to your own space, knowing the sounds your home is supposed to make, and taking it seriously when something doesn't fit that pattern, instead of assuming the least alarming explanation just because it's the easiest one to accept. I've thought about that advice a lot since, about how much easier it is, especially when you're tired, or stressed, or just don't want to deal with the hassle of investigating something further, to accept the boring explanation and move on with your life. Old buildings creak. Neighbors move furniture at odd hours. These are things we tell ourselves constantly, and most of the time, they're probably true. But I don't think I'll ever again be quite so quick to accept them without at least asking a few more questions first. I don't know, honestly, if Denise ever got the help she needed in any lasting way. I don't know if she's still receiving treatment somewhere, or if she's back out in the world trying to rebuild some kind of life after everything that happened. Part of me hopes she is. Part of me still can't fully separate that hope from the discomfort of knowing how deeply, how intimately, she'd inserted herself into my private life without my knowledge or consent for months on end. Both of those feelings are still true for me, even now. I don't think that contradiction ever fully resolves, not for something this strange and this personal. I've made a kind of peace with holding both at once, the sympathy and the violation. The sadness for whatever brought her to that point, and the lingering unease I still feel some nights. Lying in a completely different apartment, in a completely different building, listening a little too closely to sounds that are almost certainly nothing at all. Almost certainly. I want to close this out by telling you what I actually did, in practical terms. Once I moved into my new place, not because I think everyone needs to become paranoid about their walls, but because I think there's real, useful advice buried in what I learned the hard way. And I'd rather pass it along than let it just sit as a scary story with no purpose beyond the fear itself. The first thing I did, before I even fully unpacked, was walk every wall in the new apartment, knocking as I went. listening for any change in sound the way Pete had shown me almost by accident that day. I didn't find anything, for what it's worth. Just ordinary walls, ordinary hollow studs where you'd expect them. Nothing that gave me the same cold feeling that section of my old bedroom wall had given Pete the moment his knuckles hit it. I also started paying attention, in a way I never had before, to how buildings talk to you if you actually listen. Every apartment has its own sound signature, the particular way the pipes knock when the heat kicks on, the specific creak of floorboards from the unit above, the ordinary hum of an old refrigerator in the kitchen. It took me a few weeks of consciously paying attention, but eventually I built a kind of baseline understanding of what normal actually sounded like in this new place. And I think that's the real practical lesson here. More than any specific warning about hidden voids or secret tenants, know your space well enough that you'd actually notice if something in it changed. And I'll admit this feels a little silly saying out loud, but I also make a point now of actually meeting my neighbors when I move somewhere new. Not in some exhaustive, suspicious way, just a genuine effort to know who's actually supposed to be around me, so that if something ever does start to feel off, I have some frame of reference for what's normal and what isn't. I never did that in the old building. I lived there for months without meeting a single person on my floor, without ever really confirming for myself, beyond taking a leasing agent's word for it, that the apartment next to mine really was as empty as I'd been told. If there's one thing I'd genuinely ask anyone listening to take away from this, it's that. Don't just accept the easy explanation for something that doesn't sit right with you, especially when it comes to your own home, the one place you're supposed to be able to fully let your guard down. If you hear something that doesn't make sense, ask. Ask your building manager directly and specifically, the way I eventually did, rather than letting weeks go by while you talk yourself into believing it's nothing. If something still doesn't add up after you ask, don't be afraid to push further, to bring in someone qualified to actually look. The way Pete did when he noticed that walls sounded different than it should have. I think about how close I came to never finding out the truth at all. If I hadn't happened to need an outlet for a lamp with too short a cord, if Pete hadn't happened to be the particular kind of thorough electrician who taps on walls out of habit even when nobody's asked him to. I genuinely don't know how much longer that situation would have continued. Months more, maybe longer. I don't like to think about how long I might have simply continued explaining away sounds that had one of the most unsettling explanations I could have imagined, right there behind a few inches of plaster, the whole time. It's been a little over a year now, and I've mostly made peace with what happened. As much peace as I think is possible with something this strange. I sleep fine most nights, in my new apartment, in my new life. But every once in a while, usually late, usually when the building's gone quiet around me, I'll catch myself listening a little too carefully to an ordinary sound, waiting to see if it repeats, if it has a pattern, if it's something more than what it probably is. Probably. That word carries a lot of weight now, in a way it never used to before all of this happened. So if you take one thing from this story, let it be this trust that discomfort when it shows up. The walls around you are supposed to be the safest, most private boundary you have. If something ever makes you doubt that, even a little, don't wait as long as I did to find out why. I moved into a little rental house outside Beaverton, Oregon, in the summer of 2022. One of those small, single-story places on the edge of a subdivision where the streets just kind of give up and turn into tree line. I'd just finished a remote contract that let me relocate from Portland proper, and the rent out there was genuinely half of what I'd been paying for a shoebox apartment closer to the city. The backyard was the whole reason I picked the place, honestly. A good-sized stretch of grass, a tall wooden fence along the back boundary, and beyond that, a strip of second-growth forest that the realtor said backed onto a stretch of undeveloped county land. I work from home, and Oregon summers are short enough that I try to make the most of the evenings when the weather actually cooperates. Most nights, once it cooled down, around 8 or so, I'd take a book and a glass of wine out to the little patio chair I'd set up near the back of the yard, close enough to the fence that I could feel the temperature drop a few degrees where the tree shade started. The first couple weeks were exactly the kind of quiet I'd been hoping to buy myself. Birds, the occasional distant lawnmower, once a barred owl that made me jump the first night I heard it. I loved it out there. I want to be clear about that, because it makes what came after feel like even more of a loss. I actually liked sitting in that yard before I didn't anymore. It was maybe 3 weeks in that I started noticing small things I couldn't quite place. A rustle in the tree line that didn't match the rhythm of wind moving through branches, something that might have been a shadow, or might have been nothing at all, sliding across one of the narrow gaps between the fence boards. There 1 second, and then just boards again, gone before I could be sure I'd seen anything. I mentioned it to my neighbor, an older guy named Gary, who'd lived on the street for something like 20 years, while we were both out front dealing with our trash cans one collection day. "Oh, it'll be deer, probably," he said, waving a hand toward the woods. "Sometimes raccoons, too. They get into everything back there. You'll get used to the noise." It was a perfectly reasonable answer, and for a while, I believed it completely. Deer explained the rustle. Raccoons explained anything more deliberate sounding. I'm not someone who spooks easily. I grew up pretty rural myself. Plenty of nights around actual wildlife, and I didn't want to let a few ordinary forest sounds turn my favorite part of the day into something to be anxious about. But there was one detail that started nagging at me, quietly, over the following weeks. The kind of detail too small to mention to anyone out loud without sounding a little unhinged. The sound of a branch snapping. Sharp, distinct, unmistakably a branch and not just rustling leaves. Kept happening at almost exactly 9 o'clock. Not roughly 9. Not sometime in the evening. 9 on the dot, night after night, always from the same general spot along the fence line, maybe 15 feet to the left of where I usually sat. Deer don't know what time it is. I knew that. Even as I kept telling myself some version of the same tired reassurance I'd give anyone else in my position. Coincidence? Habit? Some animal pattern I didn't understand well enough to find unremarkable. I didn't say anything to Gary about the timing. I'm not sure why. Maybe because once I said it out loud, it would stop being something I could explain away. For a few weeks, that was the whole of it. A snapped branch at 9 o'clock, sharp and precise as a held note, and then silence for the rest of the evening. I got almost used to it, in the way you get used to anything that repeats often enough. I'd catch myself glancing at my watch a few minutes before 9 some nights, half consciously waiting for it, and then relaxing again once it had passed, like checking off a small, strange ritual before I could go back to my book. It was the second week of August when it stopped being just a sound. I was reading later than usual, past 10. The yard gone properly. Dark, except for the porch light and the pale wash of my phone's flashlight resting beside me on the little side table. I heard the 9 o'clock branch snap right on schedule, same as always, and thought nothing more of it. Until, maybe 40 minutes later, I heard something different. Not a snap. A softer sound. A kind of dragging scrape. Low along the base of the fence. The sort of sound a hand makes moving across rough wood. I picked up my phone flashlight without really thinking about it. More reflex than decision. And swept the beam toward the sound. For less than a second. I want to be honest about how brief it was, because I've turned this moment over so many times since that I don't trust myself to describe it as anything longer than it actually was. I saw 2 hands gripping the top edge of the fence board, fingers curled over the wood the way you'd grip something you were about to pull yourself up on. Then they were gone. Not a movement I could track. Not a scramble or a thud of someone dropping back down on the other side. Just there, and then not, in the gap between one blink and the next. I didn't move from that chair for a long time. I I remember the wine glass shaking slightly in my hand, and remember the specific, sudden awareness of every gap between every fence board, as though I were seeing the fence itself for the first time, not as a boundary, but as something with dozens of small openings, that something could be watching me through the whole time, and I'd simply never thought to look at it that way before. I went inside not long after, locked the sliding door, and sat in my kitchen with the lights on for probably another hour before I felt steady enough to go to bed. The next day, in full daylight, I walked the whole length of the fence myself, half expecting to find some obvious explanation. A low branch that could catch the light strangely, a piece of loose siding that might look, in bad lighting and a distracted glance, something like fingers. I found nothing. Just an ordinary wooden fence, slightly weathered, Noga PS wider than the others. Nothing that explained what I'd seen in that half second of flashlight. I told Gary about it that weekend, watered down slightly. I said I thought I'd seen someone's hand on the fence, left out the part about how it vanished. He frowned, more serious this time than he'd been about the deer and raccoons. That's a bit different, he admitted. You should probably keep an eye out. Might just be some kid messing around, though. Bored teenagers do dumb stuff back there sometimes. Bored teenagers. It was the kind of explanation that fit well enough to let me breathe a little easier, and for the next several nights, nothing happened at all. No branch at 9, no scraping, no hands on the fence. I told myself Gary was probably right. That whatever kid had been messing around had gotten bored, or scared off, or moved on to some other stretch of woods further from actual houses. That absence of anything lasted exactly 9 days. On the 10th, right at 9 o'clock, the branch snapped again in the same spot as always, as precisely on time as if nothing had ever paused at all. After the 9-day gap, I stopped being able to talk myself into the bored teenager theory, mostly because teenagers don't usually keep a schedule that precise for months, and definitely not one that resumed exactly where it left off after over a week of nothing. I ordered a small infrared trail camera the following week, the kind hunters used to track deer movement, and mounted it on the corner post of my patio, angled to cover the stretch of fence where the sound always seemed to originate. I told myself this was just due diligence, practical, the kind of thing any sensible person would do rather than sit outside every night wondering. The first 3 nights, the camera picked up almost nothing worth mentioning. A raccoon ambling along the base of the fence on the second night, caught in grainy white and black infrared, unbothered and unremarkable. No hands, no figure, just an ordinary backyard doing ordinary backyard things. And for those 3 nights, I let myself feel, cautiously, like maybe I'd overreacted to a strange coincidence and an unlucky trick of the flashlight. I still heard the 9 o'clock branch snap all 3 nights, right on schedule. The camera didn't catch anything causing it, just the sound, audible on the recording, with nothing visible in frame to explain it. On the 4th night, I checked the footage the next morning with my coffee still too hot to drink, scrolling through the timestamp until I hit 9:47 p.m. There was a man standing on the other side of the fence. I wasn't trying to climb it. He wasn't reaching for the top board, wasn't doing anything with his hands at all. They hung at his sides. Still, the way your arms hang when you're simply standing somewhere with no particular urgency. He was facing the fence directly, angled toward exactly the spot where I usually sat with my book. And according to the timestamp, he stood in that exact position without moving. For 28 minutes, I watched the whole clip, coffee going cold beside my keyboard, my chest tight in a way that made it hard to draw a full breath. I didn't look around. He didn't check his phone or shift his weight, or do any of the small, restless things a person does while waiting for something. He simply stood, facing my yard, for nearly half an hour, and then, at the 28-minute mark, turned and walked back into the tree line, gone from frame in a handful of unhurried steps. I sat outside that night anyway. I don't fully know why. Some combination of stubbornness and a refusal to let this thing take my own backyard away from me. And also, if I'm honest, a need to see for myself whether it was real. Nothing happened. No branch at 9, no scrape along the fence. Just an ordinary summer evening. Crickets, the porch light, drawing the usual handful of moths, and a silence that felt worse, somehow, than any of the sounds had. It was the kind of silence that feels like it's waiting for something, rather than simply being empty. For the next several nights, I didn't sit outside at all. I told myself it was because the weather had turned slightly, a stretch of cooler evenings that made the porch less appealing anyway. But that wasn't really it. And I knew it wasn't really it, even as I told myself the lie. I checked the camera footage every morning instead, coffee in hand, scrolling straight to whatever motion the sensor had flagged overnight. For 4 nights, nothing. The raccoon again on one clip, a possum on another. Ordinary wildlife doing ordinary wildlife things, in grainy infrared. No branch snap at 9, no figure. I started to relax slightly, the way I always seem to in the gaps. Right before something made it clear the gaps weren't actually the end of anything. On the 5th night, I broke my own rule and went back outside with my book, telling myself I'd just sit for 20 minutes, just to prove to myself I still could. I made it almost to 9 before I heard it. Not the branch this time, but something closer. A low, deliberate creak of wood settling under weight, coming from the exact same section of fence the camera had caught him standing behind. I didn't shine my flashlight this time. I sat very still instead, the book open and forgotten in my lap, listening to my own heartbeat. And after what felt like an impossibly long stretch of silence, I heard a voice. Quiet, almost conversational, pitched just loud enough to carry across the yard. "You read out here most nights." It wasn't a question. It was said the way you'd remark on the weather, flat and unhurried. And it took me a full 3 seconds to understand that it hadn't come from anywhere near the house. It had come from the tree line, from a spot I couldn't see clearly in the dark, close enough to the fence that whoever said it had to be standing directly against the boards. I don't remember deciding to run. I remember being inside, door locked, both hands shaking too badly to get my phone unlocked on the first 3 tries. And I remember the specific, cold clarity of realizing that whoever was back there had been listening closely enough, for long enough, to know something true about my routine that I'd never said out loud to anyone except Gary. And even then, only in the vaguest terms. I called the non-emergency police line that night, hands still unsteady, and gave a full account. The branch, the hands on the fence, the 28-minute clip. And now, a voice, close enough to be heard clearly, commenting on a habit I hadn't advertised to anyone. An officer came out the following afternoon, took photos of the fence, reviewed the trail camera footage with visible unease of his own, and told me they'd increase patrols through the area. Though he was honest that a wooded strip backing onto county land gave someone plenty of places to disappear into that weren't easily searched. For 9 nights after that visit, absolutely nothing happened. No branch, no creak of wood, no voice. I wanted badly to believe this meant it was over, that the patrols had scared off whoever it was, that the strange stillness of the past weeks had simply run its course the way strange things sometimes do. I didn't go back outside during that stretch, not once, no matter how quiet the yard seemed. On the 10th night, I finally let myself go back outside, mostly out of a stubborn refusal to let a stretch of trees I couldn't even fully see into dictate whether I got to sit in my own backyard. Gary had checked in on me twice that week, walking the fence line with me once in daylight, shaking his head and the whole thing with a kind of baffled sympathy that didn't quite reach all the way to belief. I sat down around 8:30, book in my lap, phone within easy reach, porch light on behind me. 9 o'clock came and went without a sound, no branch. I remember actually feeling something like relief settle into my shoulders for the first time in weeks. The tight coil of waiting finally starting to loosen. Then, a little after 9:30, the motion light on the side of the house clicked on. The sensor tripped by something moving along the side path. Not the back fence at all, a different direction entirely. Closer to the house than anything had ever come before. I sat frozen for a long moment before I made myself stand, made myself walk to the edge of the patio, where I could see down the narrow gap between my house and the fence line bordering Gary's property. There was nothing there. No shape, no movement, just the ordinary shadows. A motion light throws across gravel and a stretch of unmown grass. But the porch light behind me flickered, twice, in a way it had never done before. Not a power fluctuation, not the gradual dimming of a dying bulb, but 2 distinct, deliberate seeming flickers. Off and on, off and on, like something testing whether the light still worked. I went inside immediately after that. And I didn't look back at the yard again that night. Not even through the window. The camera caught something the next morning that I almost wished it hadn't. Not the man this time. Nothing from the tree line at all, just time-stamped at 9:32 p.m. The exact moment the porch light flickered on the recording. A brief, almost imperceptible shift in the frame's shadows, near the side of the house, gone before the sensor even fully registered motion. Too quick and too close to have come from anywhere near the back fence. Whoever, or whatever, this was, it was no longer staying where the fence kept it at a distance. I called the police again that day, and this time, a different officer came out. Younger, more skeptical at first, until I showed him the full folder of footage I'd been quietly compiling for weeks. I was quieter by the time he finished watching it than he'd been walking in. "We can do a proper search of that tree line," he said. "Bring a couple more officers. Go in during daylight, see if there's any sign of a campsite or anything left behind. Might take a day or two to schedule properly, but I think it's worth doing." I remember feeling, for the first time since the hands on the fence, something close to hope. Finally, an actual plan, finally. Someone with the authority and the manpower to walk into those trees and either find an explanation or rule enough of them out that I could start sleeping through the night again. I didn't go outside again until they came. The search happened 4 days later, on a bright, ordinary Saturday morning that felt almost insultingly cheerful for what we were all there to do. 3 officers, Gary hovering nearby out of what he called neighborly concern and what I suspected was mostly curiosity, and me, standing at my own back fence in broad daylight for the first time in what felt like months, watching them push through the gap in the tree line where the branch always seemed to snap. I stayed back near the fence while they went in, close enough to hear them, but not so close I'd be in the way. For the first 10 minutes, I heard nothing but the ordinary sounds of people moving through underbrush, twigs cracking underfoot, someone radioing a position back to the others, the occasional muttered comment about poison oak. Then one of the officers called out, in a tone that made my stomach drop even before I understood what he'd found. They'd found a spot, maybe 40 feet into the trees, angled with a direct sightline back toward my patio chair. You could see it clearly, even from where I stood. A narrow but unmistakable gap in the foliage that framed my yard almost like a window. Someone had set up an old folding camping chair there, weathered and half collapsed, tucked behind a dense stand of salal bushes that would have made it nearly invisible from any casual glance. Around the chair, scattered across a patch of flattened undergrowth, they found the accumulated debris of what must have been a very long time spent sitting there. Dozens of crushed soda cans, a scattering of cigarette butts pressed into the dirt, a scrap of tarp that looked like it had been used to keep the chair dry through more than one season of Oregon rain. And beside the chair, half tucked under a rock to keep it from blowing away, they found a notebook. One of the officers brought it out to show me, wearing gloves, careful with it the way you'd handle something that might matter later. I only got a glimpse before they bagged it properly. But that glimpse was enough. Page after page, filled with handwriting too neat and too patient to belong to someone doing this on a whim. Times, mostly. Long columns of times, evening after evening, spanning what looked like far more than the few months I'd lived in that house. 8:47 p.m., 9:03 p.m., 9:15 p.m. Times that, when I finally worked up the nerve to compare them against my own memory of those evenings, lined up almost exactly with when I'd actually been sitting outside. Some pages went back further than I'd been living there at all. I asked the officer, my voice not quite steady, whether that meant it wasn't about me specifically. Whether someone had simply been watching that yard, that chair, regardless of who happened to be renting the house at any given time. He didn't have an answer for that. Nobody did. They never found him. The search went on for another 2 days after that first discovery. More officers, a wider perimeter through the county land behind my house. Even a brief mention of bringing in a dog team before budget or manpower or simple practicality made that not happen. They found nothing else. No further campsites. No clear trail leading anywhere definitive. No name attached to a notebook that held, by the time someone finally counted, entries spanning close to 4 years. long before I'd ever signed a lease on that house, long before the tenant before me, according to Gary, who'd lived on the street the whole time and didn't recognize the handwriting or have any idea who it might belong to. I moved out within 6 weeks. I told my landlord it was for work reasons, which was half true. I did have an opportunity to relocate closer to Portland again, but I think we both understood the rest of it without either of us saying so directly. I didn't argue about breaking the lease early. I got the sense, from the careful way he avoided asking follow-up questions, that this wasn't entirely the first strange thing that had ever been reported about that address, though I never managed to get him to confirm that outright. I live in an apartment now. No yard, no fence, no tree line anywhere near my windows. I miss the space sometimes, in a distant, complicated way. I did love those early weeks before any of it started. The quiet, the birds, the particular kind of evening you only get with real trees nearby instead of a parking lot. I've tried, more times than I can count, to make the whole thing sit still into some explanation I can actually live with. There's a version where it really was exactly what it looked like on paper. A deeply troubled, deeply patient man who'd fixated on that yard for reasons that had nothing to do with me specifically, who'd simply never been caught because rural edge properties like that one back onto miles of land that make disappearing easy for anyone determined enough to learn the terrain. Sad and frightening, but ultimately human, ultimately explicable, if you had enough information to fully explain it, which nobody ever did. There's another version, quieter and harder to sit with, that leans on the notebook's timeline instead of the notebook's contents. 4 years of entries for a house that had at least 2 other tenants before me. All of them apparently just as carefully watched and just as carefully timed for reasons that had nothing to do with any one of us individually, and everything to do with the yard itself, the sightline, the chair positioned at exactly the angle it needed to be. I don't know which version is true. The police case, as far as I know, is still technically open, though nobody's called me about it in over a year now. I don't read outside anymore, not in any yard, not even at friends' houses with far less isolated gardens than that one ever was. If I'm sitting somewhere with my back to any kind of tree line, any stretch of hedge or fence I can't fully see past, I find myself glancing toward it every few minutes, whether I mean to or not, checking the gaps, the way I never used to before that summer, half convinced, even now, that something is counting the minutes until I look away. I moved into a house just outside Eau Claire, Wisconsin 4 years ago with my son Danny. He was 8 that summer, and the move was mostly for him, honestly. His dad and I had split up the year before, and I wanted somewhere with an actual yard, instead of the cramped apartment we'd been squeezed into during the divorce. Somewhere he could run around and be a kid again after a rough stretch for both of us. The backyard was the whole selling point of the place. A huge old oak tree, easily 80 years old according to the previous owner, with a wooden swing hanging from one of its lower branches, worn smooth by what must have been decades of use. The kind of swing that comes with a house, rather than something you'd install yourself. Danny loved it from the first afternoon we saw the place. I remember him running straight past the movers to try it out before we'd even signed anything. That first summer was as ordinary as summers get. Danny out on the swing most evenings until the mosquitoes chased him in. Me on the back porch with a book or my laptop, half watching, half working. I didn't think about that yard as anything other than the nicest part of a house we were slowly making our own. It was maybe 6 weeks, in that I started noticing something small most mornings when I let the dog out. The swing moving, gently, back and forth. A slow, steady rhythm, the kind of motion you'd expect from a light breeze catching the seat overnight. I didn't think anything of it those first few times. Wisconsin mornings get a bit of wind off the fields sometimes, and an old rope swing under an oak tree is exactly the sort of thing that would catch even a mild current. I'd watch it for a second while the dog did his business, then go back inside to make coffee, mildly charmed by it more than anything else. But there were mornings. I started noticing this properly sometime in July, when the air outside was completely, perfectly still. No rustle in the oak leaves above it. No breeze against my skin as I stood on the porch. And the swing would still be moving, that same slow, steady arc, back and forth, as though something invisible were still gently pushing it. I told myself, Each time, that wind doesn't have to be felt at ground level to affect something hanging 8 feet up in a tree canopy. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to tell yourself. I believed it, mostly, for longer than I probably should have. It was Danny who first said something that made the reasonable explanation harder to hold on to. "Mommy," he said one morning at breakfast, spooning cereal without looking up, in the completely matter-of-fact tone kids use for things that haven't yet occurred to them to be afraid of. "The swing is loud at night." "Loud how, baby?" He shrugged. "Like squeaky, every night. It wakes me up sometimes." His room faced the backyard. Mine didn't. I hadn't heard a thing. I didn't make much of it that first morning. Kids say all kinds of things, and Danny had a habit that summer of narrating half-remembered dreams as though they'd actually happened, a phase his pediatrician assured me was completely normal for his age. I chalked the squeaky swing up to exactly that, filed it away, and didn't think about it again until he mentioned it a second time, almost word for word, about a week later. "The swing woke me up again," he said, this time a little more insistent, like he'd been waiting for me to actually address it the first time and was annoyed I hadn't. "What does it sound like?" I asked, mostly to humor him. "Squeak, squeak, squeak," he said, rocking slightly in his chair to demonstrate the rhythm. Slow, like somebody's on it. That last part, like somebody's on it, sat with me longer than I wanted to admit. I told myself again that this was just a kid's imagination, doing what kids' imaginations do, filling a strange but explainable sound with a story, the same way he'd once been convinced our furnace kicking on at night meant there was a dragon in the basement. Still, that night, I stayed up later than usual, sitting in the dark kitchen with a cup of tea I'd let go cold, listening. Around 11, I heard it. Faint, but unmistakable once I was actually listening for it instead of asleep through it. A slow, rhythmic creak, coming from the direction of the yard, matching exactly the cadence you'd expect from someone swinging gently, unhurried, again and again. I went to the back door and looked out through the glass. The swing was moving. Same slow arc I'd seen most mornings, clearly visible in the wash of moonlight, the rope creaking softly with each pass. There was no wind at all that night. I remember checking, actually stepping out onto the porch for a moment, feeling nothing against my skin. No rustle in the oak leaves above, nothing. I told myself old ropes settle. Old wood contracts and shifts with temperature changes overnight. And maybe that alone was enough to start a swing moving on its own, however faint, sustaining itself a while through simple momentum before it would eventually still. It felt like a stretch even as I thought it, but it was a stretch I badly wanted to believe. Standing alone on my porch at 11 at night with an 8-year-old asleep down the hall. I checked our video doorbell the next morning, more out of curiosity than real alarm, hoping it might have caught something on its motion sensor. It hadn't. The camera was mounted at the front of the house, angled toward the driveway and front walk, with no view of the backyard at all. I'd never had a reason to think about that limitation before. That week, it started to feel like an oversight I badly wanted to correct. I ordered a small battery-powered camera that weekend, the kind meant for keeping an eye on a nursery or a porch, and set it up just inside the sliding glass door at the back of the house, angled out toward the yard and the oak tree. Nothing dramatic, I told myself. Just peace of mind. Just enough to catch a possum or a loose gutter or whatever mundane thing was actually moving that swing at night. For 4 nights, the footage showed nothing but an empty, still yard. The swing motionless, exactly the way you'd expect it to look at 3 a.m. with no one around. Danny didn't mention the squeaking those 4 nights either, and I let myself relax slightly. Telling myself whatever it had been, it seemed to have stopped. On the 5th night, I checked the footage the next morning with my coffee still too hot to drink. The swing was moving, and someone was sitting on it. I sat completely still at my kitchen table for a long moment before I made myself press play a second time, half convinced I'd misread a shadow. Some trick of the low light setting on a cheap camera doing its best with almost no available light. It wasn't a trick. There was a shape on the swing, a person, from what I could tell, though the footage was too dark and too grainy to make out anything close to a face. Just an outline, seated, roughly adult-sized, in the exact spot where Danny usually sat during the day. The timestamp read 3, 14 a.m. What unsettled me most wasn't the fact of someone being there at all, though that alone was enough to make my hands unsteady around my coffee mug. It was that the figure wasn't moving. Not the way a person actually swinging would move. No shift of weight, no push against the ground, no lean forward and back that you'd expect from someone using a swing the way swings are meant to be used. Just a still, seated shape, hands presumably in its lap, completely motionless for the entire 11 minutes the clip ran. And the swing kept moving anyway. Slow, steady, that same unhurried arc I'd been watching all summer. Rope creaking faintly on the audio, even through the camera's tinny built-in microphone. A swing clearly in motion, with someone sitting on it who was doing absolutely nothing to make it move. I watched those 11 minutes 4 times before I could bring myself to stop the footage entirely. Phone shaking slightly in my hand. Each time it reached the moment where the shape simply wasn't there anymore. Not a clip of it standing up and walking away. Not a clip of it climbing off the swing. Just there, and then, at the 12-minute mark, gone. The swing still gently rocking in the empty frame for another full minute afterward, before finally, slowly, coming to a stop on its own. I didn't tell Danny anything about the footage. I did move his bed that day, quietly, away from the window facing the backyard, telling him it was because the morning light woke him up too early. Which wasn't entirely a lie, just not the whole truth either. I called my sister that night, mostly because I needed to say it out loud to someone who wouldn't immediately dismiss it, and she listened to the whole thing. With a silence I found more unsettling than any reaction she could have actually voiced. "Have you called the police?" she finally asked. "And said what?" "A shadow sat on my kid's swing and didn't move for 11 minutes. "Say exactly that," she said. "That's a person in your backyard at 3 in the morning. That's a real thing you can report, regardless of how weird the details are." She was right, and I knew she was right. And I still put it off for 2 more days, mostly out of some stubborn, exhausted hope that if I just watched carefully enough on my own, it would resolve into something explainable before I had to say any of it out loud to a stranger with a badge. It didn't resolve into anything explainable. It got worse instead. For 2 nights after I saw that footage, I barely slept at all. I'd lie awake listening for the creak, jaw clenched, phone gripped tight enough to leave marks on my palm, half hoping to catch it live so I'd finally have something undeniable, half terrified of exactly that happening. On the second night, a little after 3 a.m., my phone buzzed with the motion alert from the camera app. I don't fully remember deciding to look. I remember the screen lighting up my whole dark bedroom and the live feed loading in grainy black and white, and the swing already in motion when the picture resolved. That same slow, unhurried arc, rope creaking softly even through the phone's tinny speaker. There was no one visibly sitting on it this time. Just the seat swinging back and forth, entirely on its own, in perfectly still night air. I stood at my bedroom window for a full minute, phone in one hand, staring down at the actual yard rather than the screen. And I could see it clearly from there too. The swing moving, no wind stirring the oak leaves above it, no rational explanation presenting itself no matter how long I stood there, willing one to appear. Then, on the live feed, without any figure walking into frame from any direction, the swing simply stopped. Not the gradual slowing you'd expect from momentum finally running out. All at once, mid-arc, like a hand had reached out and grabbed the seat still. I checked the yard through my actual window at the same moment. The swing, in real life, 30 feet below me, stopped exactly as the feed showed it stopping, in the same instant, synchronized to a degree that made my stomach drop, somewhere it hadn't dropped to yet in this whole experience. That was the night I finally called the police. I gave the full account. The swing moving on windless mornings, Danny hearing it at night, the figure in the footage, tonight's live feed. And the officer who came out the following afternoon was patient with all of it. Though I could see him working to keep his expression neutral in the particular way people do when they're trying not to make you feel foolish for something they don't yet know whether to take seriously. He walked the yard himself, checked the swing, checked the tree, checked the fence line along the back of the property for any obvious point of entry. He found nothing conclusive. No footprints in the dry summer grass, no sign of forced entry anywhere on the property, nothing beyond my own footage to suggest anyone had been there at all. "I'll be honest with you," he said before he left. The footage is strange. I can't explain it either. But without a clearer image, there's not much more we can do beyond keeping an eye on the property when we're in the area. I appreciated that he didn't dismiss it outright, even if it didn't leave me with much more than I'd started with. I thanked him, watched his cruiser pull away, and stood in my own driveway for a long moment afterward, looking at that oak tree like it was something I no longer entirely trusted, despite 4 years of it being nothing but shade and a place for my son to play. That night, I decided I wasn't going to just watch anymore. If it happened again while I was actually awake to see it live, I was going to go outside myself the second I saw it start. I didn't have to wait long. 2 nights later, my phone buzzed with the motion alert at 3:11 a.m., and this time I was already awake, lying in the dark with the app open on the nightstand beside me, as though some part of me had known tonight was the night before it actually happened. The feed loaded, grainy and pale, and there it was, the swing already moving, that same unhurried arc, rope creaking faintly through the speaker. No figure this time, not one I could make out clearly, just the seat rocking on its own in perfectly still air. I got up before I could talk myself out of it. I didn't put on shoes. I didn't grab a flashlight. I just moved, fast, driven by something closer to fury than courage at that point. 4 years in that house, months of this, and I was done watching it happen from a screen. I hit the sliding door release and stepped out onto the porch, cold concrete under my bare feet. The night air, sharp and completely still, exactly the way it always was on these nights. The yard was empty. The swing wasn't moving at all, not slowing down, not mid-arc, just hanging there, completely still, exactly the way it would look at any ordinary hour of any ordinary day. I stood on that porch for a long moment, breathing hard, waiting for some delayed motion, some proof that I'd simply been a few seconds too slow. Nothing moved. The oak stood silent above it. The whole yard settled into the kind of stillness that made me doubt, for one disorienting second, whether I'd actually seen anything on that screen at all. Then I walked closer, drawn by something I couldn't fully explain even to myself, and stopped a few feet from the swing. There, tucked just beneath the seat, sitting upright in the grass as though someone had set it down carefully rather than dropped it, was a plastic water bottle. I picked it up without thinking, and it was cold. Properly cold. Condensation still beaded on the outside. The kind of cold that comes from having just come out of a refrigerator, not from sitting outside in a Wisconsin summer night. And in the grass, just beside where the bottle had been sitting, illuminated clearly enough by the porch light, were 2 fresh footprints, pressed deep into the dry lawn, pointed toward the swing, as though someone had been standing there only seconds before I'd stepped outside. I hadn't seen anyone leave. I hadn't heard anyone run. There was nowhere they could have gone in the handful of seconds between the swing stopping on my phone screen and me reaching that spot in the yard myself. No fence gap large enough, no clear path into the trees beyond that wouldn't have made noise. Nothing. I stood there in the dark, cold bottle in one shaking hand, staring at those 2 footprints, and understood, with a clarity that made my knees genuinely go weak, that whatever had been sitting on that swing had been close enough, moments before, to have heard the door open behind it. I didn't sleep at all the rest of that night. I sat at the kitchen table with every light in the house on, cold water bottle set down on a paper towel in front of me like evidence. I wasn't quite ready to touch again, and waited for a sunrise that felt like it took far longer than it should have. I called the officer who'd come out before, first thing the following morning, and this time he came back out himself along with a second officer, and I could tell from both their faces, looking at the footprints, still visible in the dew-flattened grass and the water bottle I'd bagged in a spare Ziploc without really thinking about chain of custody, that this had moved into territory neither of them was fully prepared to explain away with a shrug about foxes or loose gutters. "We'll increase patrols through here overnight," the first officer told me, "and I want you to keep that camera running every single night from now on. Even if nothing happens. If this keeps up, we need every bit of footage we can get." I did exactly that. For the next 11 nights, the camera ran continuously. And for 11 nights, absolutely nothing happened. No creak, no figure, no swing moving in windless air. Danny slept through every one of those nights without a single complaint about squeaking, and I let myself believe, cautiously, that whatever had been coming into that yard had finally been scared off for good by the increased patrols, by the bagged evidence, by however many nights had passed since it had last gotten close enough to hear my own front door. On the 12th night, I woke on my own, with no alert from my phone at all, at almost exactly 3 a.m., from a sound I couldn't immediately place. Not the creak of the swing, something else, closer to the house. I checked the live feed anyway, heart already going fast, before I'd even fully processed why I was awake. The swing wasn't moving. The yard looked completely undisturbed, exactly as still and empty as it had every one of the past 11 nights. But in the corner of the frame, barely inside the camera's field of view, standing just at the edge of where the porch light's glow met the darker part of the yard, was a figure. Not sitting. Standing this time, facing directly toward the house. Toward the exact window where the camera itself was mounted, as though it knew precisely where the lens was pointed. As though it had known the entire time. It didn't move for the 11 minutes I watched. My whole body gone rigid, phone gripped so tight my fingers ached. It simply stood there, facing my house, facing the window I was watching from, until, at the 11-minute mark, it stepped backward, once, and was gone from frame entirely. Not walking away into the yard, not receding into the trees. Just gone. The way the seated figure had vanished from that first piece of footage weeks earlier in the space between one moment and the next. I didn't sleep again that night either. I sat with Danny's door propped open just enough that I could hear him breathing from the hallway, and I didn't close my own eyes again until well past sunrise. We moved out that October, earlier than I'd planned, breaking the lease with a story about a job relocation that wasn't entirely true. My landlord didn't push back much when I explained I needed to leave early. I got the sense, from how quickly and quietly he agreed to release me from the remaining months, that he wasn't especially surprised. Though he never said anything more specific than wishing us well. Danny never fully understood why we moved, and I never told him the whole truth of it. Just that we found a better house, closer to his school, which was true enough on its own, even if it wasn't the whole reason. He stopped mentioning the swing within a few weeks of the move, the way kids do when something stops being part of their daily life. I still notice sometimes how he sleeps with his door open now, a habit that started that October and never went away. Though I've never asked him directly whether he remembers why. I kept loose contact with one neighbor from that street, an older woman named Carol, who'd lived 2 houses down the whole time we were there, mostly through the kind of occasional text you send when you're checking in on a life you used to be part of. About 8 months after we left, she mentioned, almost in passing, that the new family who'd moved into our old house had taken the swing down entirely within their first few weeks there, hired someone to cut the rope, patch up the branch, and haul the whole thing away. Without any explanation, Carol had been able to get out of them, beyond a vague comment about it being an eyesore. I've never been able to find out anything more specific than that. I don't know if they saw what I saw, or heard what Danny heard, or whether it was simply an unrelated decision by unrelated people who happened to dislike an old wooden swing under an old oak tree. I've thought about reaching out to them directly more than once, and each time I've stopped myself before actually doing it, not entirely sure what I'd even say, or what I'd want to hear back. I've turned the whole thing over more times than I can count in the years since. There's a version I can almost make peace with on calmer days, that it really was some combination of an old, distressed rope shifting unpredictably with temperature and humidity, a series of unlucky camera angles and grainy low-light artifacts, and a deeply unsettling but ultimately human intruder who happened to leave behind a cold water bottle and some footprints during one specific, frightening close call. People do strange, quiet, patient things sometimes, for reasons that have nothing to do with anything supernatural at all. There's another version, harder to sit with, that I mostly keep to myself. That whatever sat on that swing, night after night, without ever pushing itself, was never really about the swing at all. And that whoever moved into that house after us learned that on their own terms, quickly enough to want it gone before the following summer arrived. I don't have a swing in our new backyard. I never will, if I have any say in it. And some nights, even now, If I hear anything creak outside a window facing the dark, I find myself lying very still, listening for a rhythm that isn't there, waiting to be sure of it before I let myself fall back asleep. I moved to a rental house just outside Phoenix, Arizona, back in June. One of those single-story places with a small backyard pool, which honestly was half the reason I picked it. Arizona summers are brutal, the kind of heat that doesn't really let up even after the sun's gone down. And I got into this nightly habit almost immediately. Swim for about an hour before bed, just to cool off enough to actually sleep. It became routine fast. Work, dinner, a swim under the stars, then bed. The house backed onto a stretch of desert scrub with a handful of other rentals nearby. Low wooden fences separating the yards. Nothing particularly private about any of it, though I hadn't thought much about that until later. I remember that first week, my landlord mentioning offhand that the pool light had a habit of flickering sometimes. Old wiring. Nothing to worry about, he said. Just a quirk of the house. I filed that away without really thinking about it. The kind of small detail you forget until it matters again. It was maybe 2 weeks in when I first started hearing it. Around midnight, sometimes a little later, I'd catch the unmistakable sound of water splashing. Rhythmic, steady, exactly like someone swimming laps. I'd already be in bed by then, lights off, and the sound would carry clearly through my cracked window, close enough that I'd sit up, certain someone had gotten into my pool. Every single time, I'd get up, walk out back, and find the water completely still. No ripples, no sign anything had disturbed it at all. Just the pool light, the flickering one my landlord had mentioned, casting its uneven glow across a surface as calm as glass. I told myself that first time it was probably the pump cycling, some mechanical hiccup that mimicked splashing if you were half asleep and primed to hear it. Filters do strange things sometimes, especially older systems. That explanation held up fine for about a week, but it kept happening. Same time, almost every night, that same rhythmic splashing sound rising up right as I was drifting off, and every single time, the pool sat perfectly, eerily still by the time I got outside to check. By the second week of this, I mentioned it to my neighbor, an older guy named Ron, who'd lived on the street for years and seemed to know everyone's business the way longtime residents do. He laughed it off almost immediately, said it was probably kids. Apparently there'd been a running problem for a couple summers now of local teenagers hopping backyard fences after dark to cool off in whatever pool happened to be unlocked or unwatched. Little troublemakers, he said, shaking his head. They usually clear out the second someone flips a light on. It made sense. It was the kind of explanation that fit neatly enough that I actually felt relieved hearing it. Not something wrong with the house, not something wrong with me. Just bored teenagers being bored teenagers. Except that explanation had one problem. I couldn't quite shake. Every time I went outside, the pool was already still. Not mid-splash, not the tail end of someone scrambling over the fence. Just flat, undisturbed water, like nothing at all had touched it in hours. Kids sneaking a swim don't usually manage to vanish that instantly, that silently, especially over a fence in a backyard with no real cover to duck behind. I decided to test it anyway, since Ron's explanation was at least the most comforting one available. One night, instead of checking immediately when I heard the splashing, I waited a few seconds longer, moving quietly, instead of flipping on lights and stomping out the back door the way I normally did. I eased the sliding door open just a crack, peering out into the dark yard, half expecting to catch a teenager mid-scramble over the fence. The yard was empty. The pool was still. And for the first time, standing there in that particular held-breath silence, I noticed something that hadn't registered before. The water wasn't just calm. It was completely undisturbed, no faint residual ripple at all, the kind you'd expect even seconds after someone had genuinely been swimming. It was as if the sound and the water existed in two entirely separate realities that never quite lined up. That was the night the unease properly settled into my chest instead of just passing through it. I stood in that doorway a long while, the desert night around me, doing that particular thing it does. Cicadas, distant traffic, otherwise near total silence, and felt, for the first time since moving in, distinctly like I was being watched. Rather than simply hearing things, I ordered a camera the next morning. Small, weatherproof, motion activated, angled to cover the whole pool and the stretch of fence behind it. I told myself, setting it up that evening, that I'd probably catch nothing but Ron's teenagers, after all. Some harmless, mundane explanation that would let me laugh this whole thing off within a week. The first 2 nights, the camera caught nothing at all. Not even the splashing sound repeated itself, which felt almost worse than if it had. Like whatever was happening, it simply paused to watch me watching for it. I checked the footage each morning with my coffee, scrolling through hours of still, unremarkable dark yard, a stray cat crossing the frame once, nothing else. I started to relax slightly, told myself the camera itself might have been enough to discourage whoever or whatever had been coming around, assuming it was ever a person at all, and not some mechanical quirk I still hadn't properly diagnosed. Then came the silence that unsettled me more than any splashing ever had. On the second night, right around the usual time, I lay in bed fully awake, straining to hear anything at all. And there was nothing. No water sound, no distant footsteps, no wind even. Just that particular thick, held quality the desert gets sometimes late at night, where even the cicadas seem to pause. I remember lying there, tense, waiting for something to break that silence, and nothing did. Eventually, I drifted off despite myself, and woke feeling strangely more unsettled than the nights the splashing had actually happened. Like the quiet itself had been a kind of warning I didn't know how to read. The third night, the camera finally caught something. I watched the footage the next morning, coffee going cold in my hand, my whole body tensing before I'd even processed what I was seeing. Just after midnight, a man climbed over the back fence. Not hurried, not clumsy, moving with the calm, practiced ease of someone who'd done exactly this many times before. He didn't go near the pool steps. I didn't get in the water at all. I walked slowly around the edge, tracing the perimeter with unhurried steps, pausing occasionally like he was simply enjoying the night air rather than trespassing in someone's backyard, uninvited. Then, near the deep end, he crouched down. He wasn't looking at the water. He was looking toward the house, toward my bedroom window, the glass slider that led into my room, angled so the camera caught him in profile, leaning slightly forward, perfectly still, watching. I sat there at my kitchen table for a long time after that. The footage looping in my head even after I'd stopped playing it, that particular cold, sinking feeling settling into my chest. The realization that the splashing, the sound I'd been hearing for nearly 2 weeks, had never actually been someone swimming at all. It had been something else. A signal, maybe. A way of drawing me out to the window, out to the yard, at a predictable hour, night after night, so that whoever this was could watch, undisturbed, exactly when and where I'd be. I didn't sleep at all that night, sitting instead at my kitchen table with every light in the house on, phone gripped in my hand, replaying the footage every so often just to be sure I hadn't imagined it. I thought about calling the police right then, but some part of me, the part that still wanted an ordinary explanation, still wanted this to be Ron's teenagers after all, hesitated, told myself I should wait, watch one more night, be certain before making a scene over what might, technically, turn out to be nothing more than a strange, unsettling coincidence. That hesitation is something I still think about now, looking back. The fourth night was quiet again. Same unsettling stillness as before. No splashing, no footage of anyone at the fence line, nothing at all. I remember almost convincing myself by morning that he'd been scared off for good, that whatever had drawn him there 3 nights running had simply run its course. I even caught myself thinking, embarrassed, that maybe I'd overreacted calling it anything more than a one-time trespasser who wouldn't be back. The 5th night. I checked the live camera feed before bed out of pure habit. Phone propped on my nightstand, more from residual nervousness than any real expectation of seeing anything. Around 11:30, the picture shifted, motion at the fence line. The same slow, deliberate climb I'd seen days before. I sat bolt upright, heart slamming, watching in real time as he dropped down into the yard, moved towards the pool with that same unhurried calm, and then, instead of pacing the edge like before, walked directly toward my bedroom window, crouching low just beside it, close enough that on the live feed I could see him settle in. like someone getting comfortable for a long wait. That's when I called the police, my voice shaking so badly the dispatcher had to ask me twice to repeat the address. I stayed on the line the entire time, whispering the details as quietly as I could manage, watching the live feed with my whole body rigid, terrified that any sound from inside the house might send him bolting before anyone arrived. I didn't move much during those minutes, just crouched there beside the glass, occasionally shifting his weight, patient in a way that felt far more unsettling than if he'd been pacing or agitated. Patience, I realized, watching him, was somehow worse. It meant this wasn't impulsive. It meant he expected to be there a while, undisturbed, like he'd done this so many times. He genuinely believed no one would interrupt him. The dispatcher kept me talking, asking questions to keep me calm, I think. More than for information. How many exits did the house have? Was the door locked? Could I see any part of him clearly? I remember answering in this strange, flat, functional voice that didn't feel like mine, some part of my brain that had gone very calm and practical, even while the rest of me was shaking. It felt like an eternity, though the police later told me it had been less than 8 minutes. I heard them before I saw anything on the feed. The low murmur of radios, footsteps moving carefully around the side of the house. The figure at my window went rigid the instant the first flashlight beam swept across the yard, and for one terrible second, I thought he might bolt toward the house instead of away from it. He ran for the fence instead, but he didn't make it over. I watched, still on the phone, as 2 officers moved in from the side yard and caught him scrambling at the top of the fence line, hauling him back down into the grass. There was a brief scuffle, shouting I could hear faintly even through my closed window, and then it went quiet. I didn't go outside until an officer came to the door himself, maybe 20 minutes later, and told me it was safe to open up. He had a look on his face I didn't like. Not quite alarm, but something careful, like he was choosing his next words deliberately. "You're going to want to sit down for this," he said. I sat at my kitchen table while he explained, and I remember gripping the edge of it so hard my knuckles ached. They'd found the man hiding behind a cluster of bushes near the back corner of my property. Not the fence he'd been climbing over each night, but a spot further along, tucked out of sight of both my house and my neighbors. Clearly chosen with some care. In the backpack he'd dropped while running, they found a change of dry clothes, neatly folded. Not swimwear, just ordinary clothes. The kind you'd bring if you expected to be somewhere long enough to need a change. There was food too. Granola bars, a couple bottles of water, the kind of supplies you'd pack for a stakeout rather than a quick trespass, and photographs. Dozens of them, printed and folded into a plastic sleeve. All of them my backyard, my pool, my bedroom window. Taken across what the officer estimated, from the different angles and lighting, was easily the better part of those 2 weeks I'd been hearing the splashing, maybe longer. "There's no sign he was ever actually swimming in there," the officer said, glancing toward the pool, still and quiet under the porch light. "We're honestly not sure yet how he made that sound, or if it was even coming from the water at all. Might have been something he had on him. A speaker, maybe. Or he just knew how to fake it well enough in the dark that you wouldn't question it." I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over, my skin crawling at the thought that all along, the sound I'd been chasing outside night after night, half convinced it was mechanical, half convinced it was nothing, had likely been deliberately manufactured. Bait, essentially, timed to draw me to that window at a predictable hour, so he'd know exactly when to expect me there. Exactly when the light would fall across my face through the glass. The officer mentioned, almost as an aside, that they'd be checking his photographs against reports from other addresses in the area. That something about his setup, the practiced ease of how he'd moved through my yard, suggested this wasn't the first house he'd done this to. I moved out of that house within a month, breaking the lease early, even though it cost me more than I could really afford at the time. I couldn't make myself use that pool again. Not even during the last few weeks I had left there. Not even during the worst of the heat. Every time I looked out at that still, quiet water, all I could picture was the sound of it splashing when nothing was actually moving, and the shape of him crouched patiently by my window, waiting for a light to come on. The detective who eventually took over the case called me a few weeks after the arrest, mostly to update me on what they'd pieced together, though there wasn't as much certainty in his voice as I'd hoped for. The photographs in his backpack did, in fact, match other properties in the area. Several other backyard pools, other bedroom windows, spanning what they estimated to be at least a couple of summers based on how the images had aged and changed. Whether he'd ever gotten close enough to any of those other houses to actually be caught doing what he'd done to mine, no one seemed entirely sure. Some of the property owners hadn't even realized, until police contacted them, that they'd ever been watched at all. As for the sound itself, that question was never fully answered to my satisfaction. No speaker or device was found on him that night, which left the detective offering a handful of loose theories rather than any single confident explanation. Some thought it might have been something as simple as a jug of water, splashed carefully by hand from just outside the pool's edge, close enough to carry through a cracked window, but staged just far enough from the actual water to leave no visible ripple by the time anyone came to check. Others suggested I might have partially imagined the timing of it, that once the pattern was established in my head, ordinary night sounds, wind, settling pipes, a neighbor's sprinkler system, could have folded themselves into the same expected rhythm, my mind doing the rest of the work for him. I don't know which of those is true, or if it's some combination of both, real sound and imagined reinforcement working together in a way neither of us fully understood while it was happening. What I do know is that I haven't lived anywhere with an outdoor pool since, and that in my current place, without one, I still find myself occasionally lying awake past midnight, listening for a sound that has no earthly reason to exist there at all, and feeling, every single time, a small cold relief when it doesn't come. I moved to a small town in the Scottish borders about 4 years ago now, into a cottage my grandmother left me. The kind of place with a proper back garden that just runs straight into open farmland, with nothing but a low wire fence marking where my property technically ends. I work from home, doing freelance design work, which means I spend a fair amount of my afternoons at a desk positioned right by the kitchen window, looking out over that field without really meaning to. It was late summer when I first noticed her. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old from the distance, standing right at the far edge of the field where the grass meets a line of old hedgerow. She was too far away to make out much detail. Dark hair, a light-colored coat or jumper, nothing that stood out as unusual in itself. What caught my attention wasn't how she looked. It was that she was just standing there, facing my house, not doing anything at all. Not playing, not walking a dog, not doing any of the ordinary things a kid might be doing at the edge of a field in the late afternoon. I remember thinking, that first day, that she probably belonged to one of the farms further out. That kids in places like this still wander farther than city kids ever would, and that there was nothing remotely strange about a local girl standing in a field near dusk. I went back to my work and didn't think about it again until the next afternoon, when I glanced up around the same time and found her standing in almost the exact same spot. That became the pattern, though it took me a few days to actually register it as one. Most afternoons, right around early evening, I'd glance out and there she'd be, small and still at the far edge of that field, facing my house. She never came any closer, never waved first, never called out, never did anything but stand there, watching, for however long I happened to notice her before she'd eventually be gone the next time I looked up. I didn't think much of it, honestly, for those first couple of weeks. Kids do strange, repetitive things. I told myself she was probably shy, or simply liked that particular spot for reasons that made perfect sense to an 8-year-old, and none at all to me. It was maybe 10 days in when I decided, almost on impulse, to wave at her one afternoon. Nothing more than a small friendly gesture, the kind you'd give any kid you happen to notice from a distance. I didn't expect much of a reaction, if any at all. She waved back, slow, deliberate, mirroring the motion almost exactly, and something about that small exchange settled a strange warmth in me at the time. This sense that I'd made some tiny, harmless connection with a shy local kid who liked her own company. I remember smiling to myself, going back to my work, thinking nothing more of it than that. The next day, I decided to bring her some water. It was still warm out, the kind of late summer heat that lingers even in Scotland, and it struck me, walking out with a bottle in hand, that she'd been standing out there in the sun for who knows how long most days, with no adult in sight, no bike, no bag, nothing at all. I crossed my garden, climbed over the low fence, and started walking out into the field toward where she usually stood. By the time I got halfway across, she was gone, not walking away. Gone, in the sense that there was simply no trace of her by the time I reached the spot, no figure retreating toward the hedgerow, no movement in the grass at all in any direction I could see. I stood there for a while, bottle of water still in hand, scanning the empty field, telling myself she must have simply run off quickly the moment I started toward her, faster than I'd given a kid that age credit for, ducking behind the hedge line before I'd covered half the distance. I mentioned her to my neighbor a few days later, an older man named Hamish, who'd farmed that land for decades and knew, as far as I could tell, every family for miles. He gave me a strange, careful look when I described her. Dark hair, light coat, standing at the field's edge most evenings, and said slowly that he'd never seen any child matching that description anywhere around here, not once, not in all his years working that land. I laughed it off at the time, told him maybe she was visiting relatives somewhere nearby, a summer guest passing through. I didn't laugh along with me. He just nodded, the way you nod at something you've decided not to argue about, and changed the subject. That was the evening I started thinking about getting a proper camera. Not for her exactly. Not yet. I told myself it was for the field generally, for keeping an eye on things, given how close it sat to my property. I ordered one with a decent zoom lens within the week. The camera took a few days to arrive, and by the time I had it properly mounted on a tripod near the kitchen window, angled out toward the field, I'd half convinced myself the whole thing had been nothing. An odd but ultimately harmless coincidence. A local kid with an unusual habit, and a neighbor who simply hadn't happened to notice her before. That's the story I told myself. Setting up the camera more out of idle curiosity than any real sense that I needed proof of anything. She appeared again that first evening, right around 6, same spot as always. I zoomed in, snapping a few photos through the long lens, more excited than nervous at that point. Treating the whole thing almost like a small personal project. The images came out reasonably clear once I looked at them properly. A young girl, dark hair falling loose around her shoulders, wearing a pale, slightly oversized coat that looked a size too big for her, standing perfectly still, facing directly toward my house. What struck me, looking at those photos more carefully than I had the actual live view, was her expression. Not frightened, not curious in the open, animated way children usually look when they're watching something interesting. Just still, flat, almost, in a way that unsettled me slightly, even though I couldn't have told you exactly why at the time. Over the following week, I caught her on camera 5 more times, always at 6 o'clock, near enough to the minute that I started, almost without meaning to, timing my afternoons around it. Finishing up work a little early some days, just to be sure I was at the window when it happened. 6 o'clock, every time, not 5 minutes either side, not once. I told a friend about it over the phone one evening, framing it as a strange, sweet little local mystery rather than anything alarming, and she pointed out, gently, that it was odd a kid would be allowed to wander a field alone, day after day, with apparently no adult supervision anywhere in sight. I hadn't really thought about that angle until she said it out loud. Hadn't considered that beneath the strangeness of the pattern itself, there was a simpler, more practical worry buried in it. Where were this child's parents? Why was she always alone? That was the first night I lay awake, turning the whole thing over properly. No longer quite as charmed by it as I had been a week earlier. I decided, after that conversation, that I needed to actually do something, rather than just watch and photograph from a comfortable distance. If she really was a local kid wandering alone every evening, someone should probably know, should probably be checking on her. And if I couldn't manage that myself, I at least needed to try talking to her properly, close enough to ask her name, where she lived, whether she was all right. The next evening, right on schedule, she appeared at the field's edge. I didn't wave this time. I walked straight out, crossing the low fence, moving at a steady, unhurried pace so as not to startle her, calling out something gentle as I went. Just a simple hello, nothing that should have frightened a child used to standing there day after day. She didn't move, didn't turn to run, didn't retreat toward the hedge the way she had before. She just stood there, watching me approach, and for a moment, crossing that field with the long grass brushing against my legs, I felt a small flicker of relief, thinking I might actually reach her this time. Might finally get some simple, ordinary explanation for all of this. Then, without any visible transition, no turning, no running, nothing I could properly account for, she was simply gone. One moment she was there, 30, maybe 40 feet ahead of me, and the next, the spot was empty. The hedge line beyond it undisturbed, no rustle of movement, no sound of footsteps retreating through the grass. I stood there in the middle of that field, breathing harder than the short walk should have warranted. The evening suddenly feeling very quiet, very still, in a way that pressed uncomfortably against my chest. I didn't go back to the house immediately. I stood there for a long while, scanning the hedgerow, the empty stretch of farmland beyond it, telling myself, as steadily as I could manage, that there had to be some explanation. A gap in the hedge I hadn't noticed, some fold in the land that let a small, quick child duck out of sight faster than I'd accounted for. It was fully dark by the time I made it back inside, and I remember standing at my kitchen window afterward for a long time, just looking out at that empty field, the security light over my back door, casting a faint yellow glow across the first few yards of grass and nothing beyond it. Nothing moved. Nothing happened at all. And somehow, that stillness, that complete absence of anything to explain what I'd just experienced, unsettled me more deeply than if something had. For a few days after that, she didn't appear at all. No small figure at 6 o'clock, no still, watching silhouette against the hedgerow. I told myself during that stretch that whatever had happened, my walking toward her, however she'd vanished, had simply frightened her off for good. That some local child spooked by a stranger approaching had decided to find somewhere else to spend her evenings. It was a comforting thought. I wanted very badly to believe it. The quiet unsettled me more than I expected, though. I found myself checking the field anyway, out of habit, some part of me almost missing that strange, steady presence, even as another part of me felt relief at her absence. I didn't mention any of this to Hamish again. Didn't want to hear another flat, careful denial that only deepened the unease rather than resolving it. Then, on the 6th evening of nothing, right at 6 o'clock, she was there again. Same spot, same pale coat, same still, watching posture, as though the intervening days had simply not happened at all from her end of things. I didn't approach this time. I stayed at my window, camera in hand, telling myself I'd simply observe, document, gather whatever evidence I could, without risking another strange, unexplainable vanishing act. I photographed her for several minutes, and it was reviewing those images later that night, zoomed in far closer than I usually bothered to look, that I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In several of the photos, spread across different days, there were faint marks in the grass near where she stood. Not footprints exactly. Nothing that clean, but a subtle flattening of the grass. A disturbed patch that suggested something, or someone, had been sitting or crouching there for some time before she'd arrived. Or perhaps long after she'd gone. It was the kind of detail easy to miss on a live view through a window, but unmistakable once I sat with the zoomed photographs long enough. I hadn't considered, until that moment, that she might not be entirely alone out there. That whatever brought her to that field every evening might have nothing to do with a child's wandering curiosity at all. I decided, the next morning, to walk out to that spot properly in daylight, when there'd be no strange, unexplainable vanishing to unsettle me, no dusk shadows to blame for tricks of the eye. It felt different in the full light of a Saturday morning, just an ordinary stretch of field, grass slightly overgrown near the hedge line, birds moving through it undisturbed, nothing that looked remotely sinister on its own. But when I reached the exact spot where she always stood, I found what the flattened grass in my photos had been hinting at. Scattered through this grass, half hidden by the longer blades, were sweet wrappers, several of them, bright and new, not weathered or faded, the way litter usually gets after sitting outside for any real length of time, and a few feet further, tucked in against the base of the hedge, almost invisible unless you were looking closely, sat a small children's backpack, I crouched down and unzipped it, my hands unsteady in a way I didn't fully understand yet. Some instinct already dreading what I might find. Inside, there was food. Packaged snacks, a couple of juice boxes, a sandwich still wrapped, untouched, none of it stale or spoiled, like it had been placed there recently and simply left, waiting. I called the police that same afternoon, laying out the whole strange sequence of events as calmly as I could manage, feeling faintly absurd even as I did it, half expecting to be told, politely, that I'd built an elaborate story out of a local kid's harmless picnic spot. They didn't treat it that way at all. An officer came out within the hour, examined the backpack, the wrappers, the flattened patches of grass, and told me, with a level of seriousness that did nothing to calm the growing unease in my chest, that this looked less like the leftovers of a child playing and more like something deliberately staged. Supplies left by an adult, repeatedly, in a spot chosen with clear intention, close enough to my property to be visible, far enough to keep whoever was doing it safely out of easy reach. "We'll need to keep an eye on this area for a while," he said, glancing out toward the empty field, toward the hedgerow beyond it. "This isn't the first report like this we've had in the county." They set up their own surveillance after that. Discrete cameras positioned along the tree line, the local force apparently used for exactly this kind of situation. Patient, unhurried monitoring rather than a dramatic sweep of the area, which the officer explained was more likely to actually catch someone than scaring them off with an obvious police presence. I wasn't told much about what came of it over the following weeks, only vague updates that the area was being monitored, and that I should report anything unusual immediately, day or night. She still appeared, on and off, through those weeks. Always at 6, always at that same spot, watching my house with that same flat, unreadable stillness. I'd noticed in the very first photographs. I stopped going out to her entirely after the police got involved, under strict instruction not to approach the field alone under any circumstances. I mostly just watched from the window now, camera still running, though I found I could no longer make myself feel the small, charmed warmth I'd felt that very first week. Every time I saw her standing there, I thought instead of that backpack, those unopened snacks, the flattened grass suggesting someone patient enough to wait, unseen, for however long it took. The investigation, as far as I was ever told, never resulted in an arrest. Officers confirmed eventually that the supplies in the field were replenished periodically. Someone was returning to that spot, restocking it, though whoever it was proved careful enough, or lucky enough, to avoid ever being caught clearly on camera during the weeks they monitored it. Reports came in from 2 other nearby properties describing something similar. Children seen at field edges or garden boundaries, always from a careful distance, always vanishing the moment anyone approached. Though whether those reports involved the same girl or the same person behind whatever was happening, no one could say for certain. There are explanations offered, of course, the kind that let a person function normally, again, eventually. A specialist the police consulted suggested it might be connected to a known pattern of predatory behavior, using a child, real or somehow staged, as bait to draw adults into remote areas. Though how exactly that would work practically, given how consistently she vanished before anyone got close, was never fully explained to my satisfaction. Others offered gentler theories, closer to folklore than fact, old stories. This part of Scotland apparently still carries about fields and children and things that wear a familiar shape to draw the curious closer. I don't put much stock in that explanation, and yet I've never quite been able to dismiss it either. I moved away from that cottage eventually, unable to keep living with a field I could no longer look at, without that particular cold unease settling into my chest. But an old contact from the area still checks in with me occasionally, and more than once now, months and even years after I left, she's mentioned, almost in passing, that the current tenants have reported seeing a young girl standing at the field's edge some evenings, always around 6, always watching the house, never coming any closer at all.